The night air settles over broken marble and empty arches. Grass moves through the cracks of old stone roads where senators once walked beneath coloured awnings and triumphal banners. Somewhere in the darkness, cats slip silently between fallen columns. Water drips steadily inside ruined baths large enough to hold entire neighbourhoods. The Roman Forum, once crowded with shouting merchants, magistrates, priests, and petitioners, now lies quiet beneath the moon. And yet, even in silence, the place still feels crowded, not with people, but with time itself. Because ancient Rome never truly disappeared. It remains scattered across continents in fragments that refuse to vanish completely. Its roads still cut through Europe. Its laws survive in modern courts. Its language lingers inside hundreds of millions of conversations every day. Concrete walls poured nearly 2,000 years ago still stand against sea wind and earthquakes. Entire cities across North Africa and the Middle East still carry the shape of Roman streets beneath modern neighbourhoods. In some places, farmers continue ploughing over buried villas without fully knowing what lies below their fields. And still, one mystery hangs over all of it. How does a civilization so vast, so organised, so confident in its own permanence, finally fade into ruin? The question feels especially strange because Rome does not collapse all at once. There is no single night when the lights suddenly go out across the empire. No clear ending separates Roman civilization from the worlds that follow it. Instead, the process stretches across centuries. People living through it often do not even realise they are witnessing the decline of one of history's greatest powers. Taxes continue, armies still march, emperors still issue decrees, grain ships still cross the Mediterranean, yet beneath the familiar rhythms, something fundamental slowly changes. The empire becomes heavier, harder to govern, more dependent on violence, more dependent on luck. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The strange thing is that Rome often appears strongest shortly before its greatest crises. Visitors arriving in the imperial capital during its height encounter a city unlike anything the ancient world has ever seen. Nearly 1 million people crowd into a maze of apartment blocks, temples, workshops, shrines, markets, taverns, warehouses, bath complexes, and government buildings. Marble gleams everywhere. Imported spices arrive from India. Wild animals from Africa wait inside, holding cages beneath amphitheatres. Grain from Egypt feeds vast urban populations that no Italian landscape alone could ever sustain. At night, oil lamps flicker through endless windows, climbing several stories above narrow streets. Bakers begin work before dawn. Couriers carry messages between provinces separated by thousands of kilometres. Engineers maintain aqueducts that transport fresh water across valleys and mountains with astonishing precision. Roman officials administer territories stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the deserts of Syria. To ancient observers, Rome does not merely look powerful, it looks inevitable. That illusion of inevitability becomes one of the empire's most dangerous qualities. Because Rome grows gradually accustomed to believing that expansion is natural, that order can always be restored, and that no enemy truly threatens the system itself. Even repeated disasters reinforce Roman confidence rather than weaken it. Armies are destroyed and rebuilt, cities burn and are reconstructed larger than before, civil wars erupt, then settle, emperors are assassinated with alarming frequency. Yet imperial administration continues functioning around the violence, as though the state possesses a life independent of the people ruling it. In some ways, it does. What survives in the historical record suggests that Rome's greatest strength lies not in military genius alone, but in its extraordinary ability to absorb catastrophe. Few ancient states recover from defeats the way Rome does. Entire armies vanish during wars with Carthage, yet new armies emerge. Epidemics sweep through cities, yet trade resumes. Rebellions explode in distant provinces, yet taxes continue flowing toward the centre, again and again. Rome survives situations that appear fatal. That pattern makes its eventual decline harder to understand. Modern historians still debate which pressures matter most. Some emphasise economic instability, others point toward political corruption, military overextension, environmental stress, demographic change, epidemic disease, or climate fluctuations. No single explanation fully accounts for the scale and complexity of Rome's transformation. The empire changes because many crises begin overlapping at once, reinforcing one another across generations. And beneath those visible crises lies another quieter problem. Rome becomes too successful for its own structures. The early Roman state develops as a small city surrounded by rivals. Its political traditions emerge from local struggles between aristocratic families competing for influence inside a relatively compact society. But the empire that eventually grows from those beginnings becomes unimaginably larger than the system designed to manage it. Communication across provinces takes weeks or months. Emperors rely on fragile personal loyalty networks. Armies stationed far from the capital gain increasing political importance. Wealth concentrates unevenly. Frontier regions experience realities completely different from life in Rome itself. An empire this enormous requires constant maintenance just to remain stable, and stability, in Rome, often depends on performance. Victorious generals display captured treasures through public processions. Emperors sponsor games, monuments, baths, and distributions of food. Coins carry carefully crafted images projecting prosperity and strength. Architecture itself becomes political theatre. Massive arenas and temples communicate permanence even when the state behind them struggles with debt or instability. Some scholars compare the empire to a magnificent facade constantly under repair from behind. Yet it is impossible to reduce Rome to mere spectacle, because the civilization leaves behind genuine achievements of staggering scale. Roman engineers reshape rivers, coastlines, and landscapes. Administrators govern diverse populations speaking different languages across 3 continents. Roman law evolves into one of history's most influential legal traditions. Trade networks connect Britain to Egypt and Spain to Mesopotamia. For many people living inside the empire, Roman rule brings a degree of security and predictability unknown in earlier centuries of regional warfare. At the same time, the empire depends heavily on conquest, forced labour, brutal punishment, and enormous social inequality. Behind the marble facade stand slave markets. Behind public entertainment stand political distraction and state violence. Wealthy elites inhabit luxurious villas while many urban poor survive in crowded apartment blocks vulnerable to fire and collapse. Roman prosperity rests upon systems that generate both stability and constant tension. The contradictions never fully disappear, and perhaps that is why the ruins feel so haunting now. Walking through them today means standing inside the remains of both extraordinary human achievement and extraordinary human fragility. The stones carry evidence of ambition so immense that later civilizations spend centuries trying to imitate it. But they also carry evidence that no civilization, no matter how advanced or confident, escapes time forever. Even Rome. Long before emperors rule marble palaces, before legions cross continents, before gladiators enter colossal arenas beneath roaring crowds, there is only a muddy river crossing in central Italy. A cluster of hills rises above marshland beside the Tiber. Traders move cautiously through forests where wolves still roam. Nearby villages compete, bargain, raid, and survive season by season. The future empire begins there, in a landscape that gives little hint of what is coming. The Tiber does not look like the beginning of an empire. It bends through central Italy with a practical muddy patience, carrying silt from the Apennines toward the Tyrrhenian Sea. In flood season, it spreads over low ground and turns fields into shining brown water. In summer, it narrows, slows, and exposes banks where people can lead animals down to drink. It is not the longest river in Italy, nor the most beautiful, nor the easiest to command, but near one particular crossing. Close enough to the sea for trade and far enough inland for defence, the river creates a small advantage, and in early history, small advantages can become destiny. Above that crossing rise the hills later woven into Rome's identity, the Palatine. Capitoline, Aventine, Caelian, Esquiline, Viminal, and Quirinal. Their slopes are not dramatic mountains. They are defensible islands of high ground above marshes, burial areas, tracks, huts, and patches of cultivation. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that communities live on and around these hills long before Rome becomes a city in the formal sense. People build huts from timber, clay, reeds, and thatch. They bury their dead with modest goods. They herd animals, grow grain, trade salt, and watch the movements of neighbouring peoples with the alertness required in a world without strong central protection. The later Romans loved to imagine their city as chosen by fate from the beginning. Their stories give Rome a heroic birth, twin brothers, abandoned and saved by a she-wolf, a boundary marked by a plough, a quarrel that ends in blood. Romulus, the founder, becomes both king and killer in the same breath, as if Rome itself is born from protection, violence, and sacred order at once. The famous date attached to this founding, 753 BCE, belongs more to Roman tradition than to precise archaeological certainty. Scholars still debate how much historical memory survives inside the legend. The evidence remains incomplete, but beneath the myth there is a real process, scattered settlements slowly joining into something larger. That process is less clean than a founding story. It unfolds through contact, competition, and geography. Rome sits in Latium, a region of Latin-speaking communities, but it is never isolated. To the north are the Etruscans, whose cities possess wealth, art, complex religious practices, and deep connections across the Mediterranean. To the south and east are other Italic peoples, including Sabines, Volscians, Aequi, and later Samnites. Greek colonies flourish farther south along the coast of Italy and Sicily, bringing new forms of writing, art, architecture, warfare, and trade. From the beginning, Rome is not a pure creation sealed inside its own hills. It is a crossroads. That matters because Roman identity forms through borrowing as much as invention. The Romans eventually become famous for absorbing the useful habits of others without losing their own sense of superiority. They adapt letters from Greek models transmitted through Etruscan influence. They learn religious and political symbols from neighbours. They absorb gods, rituals, military practices, and building techniques. Later Roman writers often present this as a sign of wisdom. Though it can also look like cultural hunger, Rome becomes powerful, partly because it is never embarrassed to take what works. In the earliest layers, daily life is small, smoky, and physical. Houses are dark inside, warmed by hearths and crowded with tools. Food is simple grains, beans, lentils, vegetables, fruit when available, milk products, and occasional meat. Salt is valuable enough to shape trade routes and perhaps even early patterns of power. The nearby salt pans at the mouth of the Tiber connect inland communities to coastal resources. A road later remembered as the Via Salaria, the Salt Road. carries one of life's most necessary substances into the interior. It is a humble detail, but empires often begin with humble logistics. The landscape itself demands cooperation. Low areas between the hills are wet and unhealthy, especially before drainage works transform them. The future forum begins not as a marble civic centre, but as a marshy zone between settlements, a place that must be controlled before it can become political. Early drainage, especially the works later associated with the Cloaca Maxima, may begin in forms more modest than Roman memory claims, but the basic transformation is crucial. A valley that once divides communities becomes a shared meeting ground. A wet hollow becomes a public space. The geography of separation slowly becomes the geography of unity. This is one of the quiet mysteries of early Rome, how separate hill communities become one city with common rituals, institutions, and ambitions. There is no single surviving document explaining it. The evidence comes from graves, pottery, hut foundations, later traditions, comparative archaeology, and cautious reconstruction. What survives in the record suggests gradual consolidation, but the speed and exact nature of that consolidation remain debated. There may have been alliances, intermarriage, elite competition, religious integration, and possibly coercion. The later Romans remember early conflicts with the Sabines, including stories that are clearly shaped by myth and moral lesson, but behind them may lie memories of real merging between neighbouring groups. Even before Rome becomes famous, its position gives it unusual potential. It controls a crossing of the Tiber, it sits near routes linking Etruria, Latium, and Campania. It has access to inland agriculture and coastal trade. Its hills offer defence without cutting the settlement off from movement. It is close enough to larger cultures to learn from them, yet not so dominated that it cannot develop its own path. These are not guarantees. Many places have advantages and never become empires. But Rome's early landscape gives ambition a place to root. There is a lesser-known detail in the earliest Roman story that makes the city feel more human than legendary. Archaeologists have found traces of huts on the Palatine Hill that resemble the kind of dwellings later Romans preserved symbolically as sacred reminders of their simple beginnings. Centuries after Rome becomes a city of stone, emperors still maintain a hut associated with Romulus, repairing it when damaged, treating its fragility as holy. Whether or not the hut truly connects to any founder, the gesture reveals something important. Romans at the height of power remain fascinated by the idea that their civilization began in poverty, roughness, and discipline. That memory becomes political. Roman elites later praise the hard virtues of the ancestors: frugality, courage, loyalty, endurance, obedience to law, suspicion of luxury. Of course, those praises often come from men living in considerable luxury themselves, which is one of history's quieter jokes. But the ideal matters. Rome imagines its greatness as emerging not from softness, but from struggle. Muddy fields, wooden huts, stern fathers, dangerous neighbours. And gods who demand proper ritual all become part of the Roman self-image. Religion is already woven into the ordinary world. Early Romans do not separate sacred and practical life in the modern way. Boundaries, doorways, fields, hearths, springs, groves, and family storerooms can all carry divine presence. Ritual correctness matters because the world is full of powers that must be respected. Later Roman religion becomes famous for its formal precision, its priests, calendars, omens, auguries, and sacrifices. In the beginning, those habits grow from a landscape where survival depends on reading signs, honouring limits, and maintaining relationships with forces beyond human control. The dead also shape the living city. Burial grounds mark social patterns and changing customs. Some early graves are cremations, others are inhumations. Grave goods vary, hinting at status differences but not yet the immense wealth disparities of later Rome. The people buried there do not know they are ancestors of an empire. They belong to families navigating local concerns, harvests, marriages, raids, illnesses, disputes, rituals, and seasons. Yet their settlements gradually create the framework from which Roman history will unfold. As the villages beside the Tiber grow more connected, leadership becomes more visible, larger buildings appear, public spaces develop, imported goods signal broader contacts, elite families compete through ceremony, warfare, and display. The city begins to need rulers, or at least later Romans remember it that way, and before the Republic, before consuls and senators become the symbols of Roman liberty, tradition places kings at the beginning of the city's political life. These kings stand in the mist where legend and history overlap. Some may preserve memories of real leaders, others are shaped into moral examples by later generations. But through them, Rome tells a story about how a cluster of huts becomes a community with walls, rituals, laws, enemies, and destiny. The river crossing is no longer just a crossing. The hills are no longer just hills. Something has gathered there, still small enough to vanish, but already difficult to ignore. The kings of early Rome stand like figures seen through smoke. Their names are clear in later tradition, but the world around them is harder to hold. Romulus, Numa, Tullus Hostilius, Ancus Marcius, Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus form a neat sequence in Roman memory, each given a role, a temperament, and a lesson. One is the warrior founder, one is the priestly lawgiver, one is aggressive and impatient for battle, one builds and expands, one brings foreign splendour, one reorganises the people, one becomes the tyrant whose fall gives birth to liberty. It is almost too orderly, and that is why scholars still debate how much of the monarchy can be treated as history in the strict sense. Yet even when the stories are polished by later imagination, they preserve something essential. Rome remembers its earliest government as sacred, military, practical, and dangerous. The king is not simply a crowned ruler in the later medieval sense. He is war leader, judge, priestly figure, and guardian of the community's relationship with the gods. His power must be visible because early Rome is still a place of fragile order. Boundaries need defending and disputes need settling, rituals need correct performance. Neighbouring peoples must be resisted, persuaded, absorbed, or feared. The king stands at the point where force and ceremony meet, in later republican memory. This concentration of power becomes suspicious, even poisonous. But in a small early city, unified leadership may have been less a luxury than a necessity. The second king, Numa Pompilius, is remembered not for conquest but for religion. Later, Romans credit him with priesthoods, calendars, rituals, and sacred discipline. Whether one man truly created these institutions is uncertain, but the tradition reveals how deeply Romans believe their city depends on religious order. The gods do not ask Rome for private emotion, they ask for precision. A ritual performed incorrectly can be repeated, a vow must be fulfilled. Omens must be interpreted by trained specialists. This habit of religious exactness becomes one of Rome's most enduring traits. It is not gentle mysticism, it is a contract with the unseen world, maintained through procedure. That procedural instinct appears everywhere. Rome slowly builds customs around authority. Elders advise, families preserve status, warriors follow commanders, priests guard rights, assemblies may gather, though their earliest forms are difficult to reconstruct. The Senate itself, later so central to Roman political identity, is said to begin as a council of leading men. The Latin word connected with age gives it an air of ancestral authority. In practice, it represents elite continuity. Kings may command, but powerful families remember, negotiate, and endure. The evidence remains incomplete, especially for the earliest monarchy. Archaeology can show growth, trade, construction, and cultural influence, but it rarely confirms the dramatic personal stories preserved by Roman writers centuries later. What survives in the record suggests that Rome becomes increasingly urban during the period traditionally assigned to the kings. Public architecture expands. The forum is drained and organised. The Capitoline becomes a religious centre of enormous importance. The city's scale and ambition grow. Whether the named kings personally drove these changes matters less than the broader transformation Rome is becoming a city-state. Etruscan influence becomes especially important in this transformation. To the north, Etruscan cities are wealthy, sophisticated, and deeply connected to Mediterranean networks. Their art, metalwork, tombs, temples, and religious practices reveal a world far more complex than older stereotypes allow. Rome absorbs much from them. The symbols of authority later associated with Roman magistrates, including the bundle of rods known as the fasces, have strong Etruscan associations. So do certain forms of triumphal display, elite ceremony, religious interpretation, and possibly aspects of urban planning and monumental building. The Romans later prefer to present themselves as masters of destiny, but in this early period they are also students. One of the most striking examples is the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, traditionally dedicated near the end of the monarchy or beginning of the Republic. Its scale marks a leap in civic ambition. The temple announces that Rome is no longer merely a settlement among others. It claims a central place in the sacred and political geography of Latium. The building itself does not survive in its original form, but ancient descriptions and archaeological traces suggest a monumental structure influenced by Etruscan temple design. Here, religion becomes architecture, and architecture becomes a declaration of power. The kings are also linked with expansion. Rome's early wars against neighbouring communities may have been small by later imperial standards, but for the people involved they are existential. A captured town means land, captives, alliances, and prestige. A defeat can mean humiliation, enslavement, or disappearance. Later Romans tell of Alba Longa, the older Latin city supposedly destroyed under Tullus Hostilius, with its leading families transferred to Rome. The details are wrapped in legend. But the pattern is plausible. Rome grows by incorporating rivals as well as defeating them. This habit becomes one of its greatest strategic advantages. Rome often turns former enemies into future Romans, though not always generously and rarely without hierarchy. A lesser known but revealing tradition concerns the asylum said to have been established by Romulus. According to later accounts, Rome welcomes fugitives, exiles, runaway slaves, and marginal men in order to grow its population. The story may be mythic, shaped by hostile jokes about Roman origins, but it points to a deeper truth. Rome's identity is unusually open to incorporation compared with many ancient communities. It can turn outsiders into members, members into soldiers, and soldiers into instruments of expansion. This does not make Rome humane in any modern sense. It makes Rome adaptable. Servius Tullius, the sixth king in tradition, embodies that adaptability in political form. Later, Romans credit him with organising the citizen body according to wealth and military function. The so-called Servian reforms classify men for taxation and service, linking political weight to property and arms. Scholars still debate whether these reforms belong to a single historical ruler or reflect later developments projected backward. but the principle is deeply Roman citizens are counted. Ranked, armed, and obligated, the community becomes legible to itself. Power depends not only on noble birth, but on resources, military usefulness, and civic duty. The city also gains walls, or at least later memory associates early fortifications with Servius. The surviving Servian wall visible in parts of Rome today mostly belongs to a later Republican phase after the Gallic sack. But the tradition of enclosing and defining the city remains important. Walls are not only military defences, they mark the boundary between inside and outside, order and danger, citizen and stranger, sacred space and uncertain world. For Romans, boundaries matter intensely. Crossing them without permission can be a religious and political act. The old story of Remus mocking Romulus's wall and dying for it may be legendary, but it captures a real Roman obsession. The line around the community is sacred because the community itself depends on limits. Yet monarchy carries its own danger. The final king, Tarquinius Superbus, is remembered as proud, violent, and illegitimate in spirit if not in title. His reign becomes a moral drama about arrogance. He builds grandly, rules harshly, ignores proper counsel, and allows royal power to become personal domination. The crisis comes through an act of sexual violence committed by his son against Lucretia, a noblewoman whose death becomes, in Roman memory, the spark that ignites revolution. The story is shaped by later ideals of honour, gender, family control, and political liberty, and modern readers must approach it carefully. But for Romans, it explains why kings become intolerable. The abuse of one household reveals the corruption of the entire monarchy. With Tarquin's expulsion, Rome claims to reject kings forever. The hatred of the word king becomes one of the deepest reflexes in Roman political culture. Even centuries later, ambitious men can be destroyed by the suspicion that they seek royal power. The irony, of course, is that Rome will eventually create emperors who possess far more power than any early king could have imagined. But for a long time, the Republic defines itself against monarchy. It insists that liberty means shared rule among citizens, annual magistracies, accountability, and resistance to tyranny. This memory of liberation may not preserve the exact events of 509 BCE, the traditional date of the Republic's birth. The transition was probably more complicated than a sudden patriotic uprising. It may have involved aristocratic rivalry, changing relations with Etruscan power, local conflict, and gradual institutional evolution. No single explanation fully accounts for this transformation, but the result is clear enough. Rome emerges from its royal past with a political myth stronger than most written laws. No man must be allowed to stand permanently above the rest. From this point forward, Roman history becomes a long struggle over what that principle means. The city has learned from kings how to command, build, organise, fight, and perform sacred power. Now it must discover whether a community without kings can govern itself without tearing itself apart. The Republic begins with a refusal. Rome will have no king. The word itself becomes dangerous, almost contaminated, a memory of arrogance and private power. In place of one ruler, the Romans create offices divided, limited, watched, and repeated year after year. Two consuls hold supreme authority together, each able to restrain the other. Their power lasts only 12 months. Beneath them, other magistrates manage law, finance, public order, religious duties, and military needs. Around them stands the Senate, not yet a modern legislature, but a dense body of aristocratic influence, memory, prestige, and pressure. Rome does not become democratic in the modern sense. It becomes something stranger, a citizen state built from suspicion, hierarchy, ritual, and competition. And the early republic is not peaceful. It is tense from the beginning, because removing kings does not remove inequality. Rome's noble families still dominate land, priesthoods, military command, and political knowledge. Ordinary citizens, the plebeians, carry burdens of debt, military service, taxation, and dependence on powerful patrons. They fight in Rome's armies, farm its fields, raise its children, and defend its walls, yet they do not initially share equal access to authority. The result is not one clean revolution, but a long internal struggle known as the conflict of the orders. It unfolds over generations, sometimes quietly, sometimes dramatically, as plebeians push for protection, representation, and recognition. One of Rome's most revealing solutions is not a battlefield victory, but a withdrawal. In tradition, plebeians leave the city and refuse to serve, forcing the patrician elite to negotiate. Whether each secession occurred exactly as later writers ascribe remains debated, but the pattern captures a real political truth. Rome's lower citizens possess power because the state needs their bodies. Without them, fields go untilled and armies shrink. Out of this pressure comes the office of tribune of the plebs, a remarkable institution. Tribunes can defend plebeians against magistrates and eventually block certain public actions. Their persons become sacrosanct, protected by a religious oath. In a city obsessed with hierarchy, Rome creates an official guardian of the politically vulnerable, though always within limits and always under pressure from elite manipulation. The creation of written law becomes another turning point. The 12 tables, traditionally produced in the mid-5th century BCE, do not create equality, but they make legal custom visible. Before writing, aristocrats hold immense power because they know the procedures. Law hidden inside memory favours those already in command. Law displayed publicly gives citizens something to invoke, contest, and teach. The surviving fragments are blunt, practical, and sometimes harsh. They concern debt, family authority, property boundaries, injury, funeral practices, and procedure. They reveal a society where fathers wield severe power, creditors can be merciless, and social status matters deeply. Yet the very act of inscription marks a change. Rome begins to imagine itself as a community governed not only by men, but by publicly knowable rules. This is one of the Republic's great paradoxes. It is unequal, often brutal, and dominated by elite families. Yet it produces a political culture in which power must constantly justify itself through tradition. Law, office, election, ancestry, service, and public reputation. Ambitious aristocrats compete fiercely, but they are expected to compete in recognizable ways. A man seeks office, wins military glory, sponsors games, builds monuments, prosecutes rivals, honors ancestors, and claims to serve the Republic. Personal ambition is not eliminated, it is harnessed. For a time, that harness holds. Family lies at the centre of this world. The Roman household is both domestic unit and political foundation. The paterfamilias, the senior male head, holds legal authority over descendants, property, slaves, and household rights. In practice, real family relationships vary, and women of elite families can exercise influence through marriage alliances, wealth, religious roles, and informal networks. But Roman ideology presents the household as a miniature state-ordered, disciplined, ancestral, and hierarchical. The Republic's public virtues begin at the hearth. Duty to family, gods, and city blur together. Religion continues to structure politics. Magistrates take auspices before major acts. Priests guard calendars and rituals. Omens can delay assemblies or justify decisions. Modern observers may be tempted to separate sincere belief from political convenience, but in Rome the two are often intertwined. A badly timed omen is both a religious warning and a political fact. A ritual mistake can become a public crisis. The gods are not distant decoration, they are part of constitutional life. Meanwhile, Rome's relations with surrounding peoples remain unstable. The young republic faces pressure from Latin neighbours, hill tribes, Etruscan cities, and internal uncertainty. It is not obvious that Rome will dominate Italy. In fact, early Rome is nearly destroyed more than once. The most famous shock comes with the Gallic sack, traditionally dated 390 BCE, when warriors from the north defeat Roman forces and enter the city. Later Roman memory turns the disaster into a moral lesson about vigilance, discipline, and divine warning. Archaeological evidence for the exact scale of destruction is complex, and scholars still debate details, but the psychological impact in Roman tradition is enormous. Rome learns that its walls can be breached, its sacred places threatened, and its survival humiliated. Humiliation hardens memory. After the Gallic crisis, Rome invests more seriously in defence, organisation, and military adaptation. The Republic becomes increasingly skilled at turning fear into reform. Its army evolves from earlier hoplite-style formations toward more flexible systems suited to Italy's broken landscapes. Citizen soldiers serve according to property class, bringing equipment appropriate to their means. Campaigning is seasonal at first, tied to agriculture. But repeated warfare gradually normalises military service as a core part of citizenship. To be Roman is increasingly to be ready for war. Yet Rome's expansion through Italy is not only a story of conquest, it is also a story of treaties. This is one of the lesser-known reasons Rome becomes so formidable. Instead of ruling every defeated community in the same way, Rome develops a web of statuses, full citizens, partial citizens, Latin allies, colonies, municipia, treaty partners. Some receive voting rights, some receive legal protections without full political voice, some owe troops but retain local institutions. This uneven system can be exploitative and resented, but it is also flexible. Rome does not need to station armies everywhere if it can bind communities through obligation, privilege, fear, and hope. Colonies become anchors of control. Roman and Latin settlers are placed in strategic locations, often on captured land, creating loyal communities that secure roads, watch enemies, and spread Roman influence. Roads themselves begin to reshape Italy. The Via Appia, built from 312 BCE, pushes southeast from Rome toward Campania and later beyond. It is a road of stone, logistics, and ambition. Armies move faster, messages travel more reliably, markets connect, control becomes physical. The Roman state is learning that power is not just won in battle, it is laid into the ground. The Republic also develops a political rhythm of crisis and response. When ordinary magistracies seem insufficient, Rome can appoint a dictator for a limited emergency command. The title later becomes ominous because of men like Sulla and Caesar, but in the early Republic it is meant as a temporary concentration of power under strict expectation of resignation. The idea reveals Roman practicality. Even a state built on fear of kings admits that sometimes speed matters more than shared authority. The danger lies in whether temporary power can truly remain temporary, once ambition grows larger than restraint. For now, restraint mostly survives. The elite code values honour, public service, ancestral example, and fear of disgrace. Nobles display wax masks of ancestors during funerals, reminding the living that they are watched by the dead. A young aristocrat grows up beneath faces that seem to demand achievement. This ancestral pressure is difficult to overstate. Rome's ruling families do not merely want wealth, they want memory. They want their names attached to victories, laws, temples, roads. And offices? The Republic becomes an arena where private glory must be translated into public usefulness. What survives in the record suggests that this system works because Rome's ruling class and citizen body share enough interest in expansion. Victories bring land, booty, status, security, and opportunity. Defeats bring reforms. Allies are incorporated. Rivals are divided. Laws are contested but preserved. The Republic is not gentle, but it is energetic. Its institutions are imperfect, yet adaptable. Its citizens complain, resist, bargain, fight, and continue showing up. By the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, Rome is no longer just one Latin city among many. It has become the strongest power in central Italy, then in much of the peninsula. But every victory creates a wider horizon of danger. Beyond the hills and plains of Italy lie wealthier cities, older cultures, professional armies, and seas controlled by others. Rome's habits have been formed in local struggle. Soon those habits will be tested on a scale the early Republic was never designed to imagine. The Republic grows by learning not to break. Its enemies often defeat it tactically, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes humiliatingly. But Rome develops a habit more frightening than quick victory. It returns. It raises another army. It repairs alliances. It punishes weakness, rewards loyalty, remembers betrayal, and presses forward again with the heavy patience of a state that treats loss as an instruction rather than an ending. In Italy, this becomes the foundation of Roman power. Rome does not simply conquer because its soldiers are always better. It conquers because its system survives the death of soldiers. The wars against the Samnites reveal this with unusual clarity. The Samnites are not soft opponents waiting to be absorbed by destiny. They are fierce highland peoples of the central and southern Apennines, accustomed to difficult terrain, mobile warfare, and local independence. Their world is made of ridges, valleys, fortified settlements, and narrow passes where Roman formations can be trapped and embarrassed. Rome's early strength lies in discipline and organisation. But Italy's mountains punish overconfidence. The Republic must adapt or bleed itself useless. One of the most famous humiliations comes at the Caudine Forks in 321 BCE, where a Roman army is trapped in a mountain pass and forced to surrender under disgraceful terms. Later accounts describe Roman soldiers passing beneath a yoke, a symbolic submission that sears itself into Roman memory. The details are shaped by moral storytelling, and scholars still debate aspects of the episode, but the meaning is unmistakable. Rome can be cornered, Roman commanders can fail. Roman pride can be made to kneel, yet the Republic does not dissolve after humiliation. It broods, reorganises, and continues the war. This ability to continue depends on manpower. Rome's alliance system turns Italy into a reservoir of soldiers. Defeated communities are not always destroyed. Many are bound into obligations. Allies provide troops. Colonies hold strategic ground. Roads connect military zones. The result is a structure deeper than one city's population. When one army is lost, another can be assembled from Roman citizens and Italian allies. This does not mean the system is beloved. Many allies carry burdens without equal political rights, a grievance that will one day explode. But for now, it gives Rome a terrifying resilience. The Roman army also changes. The rigid formations suited to flatter battlefields give way to more flexible arrangements, often associated with maniples, smaller units capable of manoeuvring across uneven terrain. The exact pace of this development remains debated because later sources describe earlier military systems through the lens of later practice. But the broad pattern is clear enough. Rome learns from the landscape and from its enemies. It becomes less elegant and more effective. Its battlefield culture prizes discipline, engineering, camp construction, punishment, rewards, standards, and the steady conversion of chaos into procedure. Every night on campaign, Roman soldiers build camps with remarkable regularity. Even temporary camps follow an ordered plan, with ditches, ramparts, gates, streets, and command spaces. This habit may seem mundane compared with dramatic battles, but it is one of the secrets of Roman success. A marching army carries a portable version of Roman order into hostile territory. After a day of fear, dust, and exhaustion, the camp recreates hierarchy. The general has his place. The standards have their place. The soldiers have their assigned spaces. Even in enemy land, Rome makes a grid. A lesser-known detail reveals the severity of this military culture. Roman discipline can include decimation, an extreme punishment in which a unit judged cowardly may be forced to execute one man in 10 by lot. The practice is not common, and later writers mention it partly because it is shocking, but its existence captures the harsh logic of Roman command. Fear is turned inward as well as outward. Courage is not treated as a private feeling. It is enforced as a public obligation. By defeating the Samnites after long struggle, Rome gains far more than territory. It gains confidence that its methods can overcome hard environments and stubborn peoples. But Italy remains unfinished. Greek cities in the south, especially Tarentum, view Roman expansion with alarm. These cities are culturally wealthy, connected to the wider Hellenistic world, and accustomed to dealing with powers across the sea. When conflict comes, Tarentum calls for help from Pyrrhus of Epirus, one of the most capable commanders of his age. Pyrrhus arrives with professional soldiers, cavalry, and war elephants, animals that must have seemed almost unreal to many Romans encountering them for the first time. Against Rome, he wins battles. at Heraclea and Asculum. His forces demonstrate the power of Hellenistic warfare. The elephants terrify horses, the phalanx and professional troops test Roman flexibility. Yet Pyrrhus discovers the same problem that earlier enemies discovered. Winning against Rome is not the same as defeating Rome. His victories cost too much. Roman losses are replaced more easily than his own. From this grim arithmetic comes the phrase later remembered as a Pyrrhic victory success so costly that it begins to resemble defeat. The evidence for specific speeches and dramatic moments in these campaigns remains filtered through later literary tradition, but the strategic pattern is credible. Rome absorbs losses that would cripple other states. Pyrrhus eventually leaves Italy. The Greek cities of the south fall under Roman dominance. By the early 3rd century BCE, Rome controls most of the Italian peninsula through a combination of citizenship grants, alliances, colonies, garrisons, confiscations, and negotiated privileges. This transformation changes Rome's imagination. A city that once worried about neighbouring hills now commands Italy from the Po Valley's edge toward the straits near Sicily. The Mediterranean is no longer distant scenery, it is a frontier. And across that water lies a power unlike any Rome has yet faced. Before that confrontation, it is worth lingering on what Roman rule in Italy actually means. It does not erase local identities overnight. Oscan, Umbrian, Etruscan, Greek, and other languages continue to be spoken. Local elites remain important. Cities retain customs, gods, and memories. Romanization is not a simple wave washing everything clean. It is uneven, negotiated, resisted, and opportunistic. Some communities gain from Roman order, others lose land and autonomy, many do both at once. The Republic's genius lies in making domination feel to enough people, like participation. An allied city may resent troop demands but hope for protection. A local elite may dislike Roman interference but gain status through cooperation. A settler colony may bring Roman habits into new regions while depending on local labour and exchange. Roads, markets, military service, law, and intermarriage slowly thicken connections. Italy becomes not merely conquered territory, but a political machine feeding Rome's wars. Still, beneath this machine are future cracks. The allies who supply so many soldiers do not all possess full citizenship. They fight in Rome's armies, share dangers, and help win victories. Yet Rome remains careful about distributing political equality. This imbalance is manageable while conquest brings rewards. It becomes dangerous when burdens feel heavier than benefits. No single explanation fully accounts for Rome's later internal violence. But the unequal partnership built during Italian conquest is one of the roots. For the moment, however, success hides the problem. Rome's expansion seems to confirm its virtues. Discipline defeats mountains, persistence defeats kings, alliances multiply manpower, roads turn distance into reach, law converts conquest into structure. The Republic has become a hard, practical engine, powered by citizens, allies, ambition, and fear. But engines built for land warfare do not automatically master the sea. Rome has little tradition of naval empire. Its aristocrats understand fields, armies, elections, and ancestral honours far better than they understand long-distance maritime competition. Across the western Mediterranean, Carthage already possesses what Rome lacks: ships, harbours, commercial networks, experienced sailors, and centuries of overseas power. The two states are not doomed to fight from the beginning. But as Rome reaches southern Italy and Sicily becomes impossible to ignore, their worlds begin pressing against each other. A local conflict on an island will soon become something much larger. Rome, trained by Italian wars to endure almost anything, is about to face an enemy wealthy enough to rebuild fleets, clever enough to avoid Roman strengths, and distant enough to turn victory into exhaustion. The Republic has learned how to conquer land. Now it must discover whether its stubbornness can survive the sea. Carthage rises across the water like a warning Rome does not yet fully understand. Its harbours open toward the western Mediterranean, where merchant ships move through lanes older than Roman power. Long before Rome becomes master of Italy, Carthage has already learned the sea. Its sailors know Sardinia, Sicily, North Africa, Iberia, and the delicate geography of islands, straits, winds, and ports. Its wealth comes not from one muddy river crossing but from a maritime network, a web of trade. Tribute, agriculture, metals, and colonies. To Roman eyes, Carthage is foreign, rich, sophisticated, and unsettling. To Carthaginian eyes, Rome may at first seem like an aggressive land power whose confidence has grown faster than its experience. The first great clash begins over Sicily, an island positioned like a stone between worlds. Sicily is fertile, urbanized, and contested, with Greek cities, local communities, Carthaginian strongholds, and mercenary armies all entangled in shifting alliances. Rome enters this world almost awkwardly, drawn by opportunity and obligation into a conflict far beyond its familiar Italian pattern. The First Punic War becomes a brutal education. Rome needs ships, so Rome builds them. Later tradition claims the Romans copy a captured Carthaginian vessel, and while the story may be simplified, the underlying point is plausible. Rome has no shame about learning quickly from an enemy. Yet building ships is not the same as becoming a naval civilization. Thousands of men must row in rhythm. Commanders must understand weather, currents, coastline, and timing. Fleets can be destroyed without a sword striking flesh. Storms drown soldiers by the tens of thousands. Rome suffers catastrophic naval losses, some from battle, some from nature. The evidence remains incomplete in places, but ancient accounts suggest human costs on a scale almost difficult to imagine. The Republic keeps building, keeps recruiting, keeps borrowing money, keeps returning to the sea as if stubbornness itself can become seamanship. One strange Roman invention from this war captures the mentality of a land power trying to solve a maritime problem. The corvus, a boarding bridge fitted to warships, allows Roman soldiers to grapple enemy vessels and turn sea battles into something closer to infantry combat. Its effectiveness and duration are debated by scholars, and some accounts may exaggerate its importance, but symbolically it is perfect. Rome looks at the sea and tries to make it behave like land. Where Carthage has sailors, Rome brings legionaries. Where Carthage maneuvers, Rome tries to close, board, and fight. After more than 2 decades, Carthage yields Sicily. Rome gains its first province. This is a quiet revolution. A province is not an Italian ally. It is territory governed for Rome's benefit, taxed and administered under Roman authority. The Republic has crossed a threshold. Its power now extends beyond Italy, and with that extension come new habits: overseas taxation, provincial governors, opportunities for enrichment, corruption, exploitation, and long-distance control. Victory at sea has opened a door Rome will never close. The peace after the First Punic War is not true peace. Carthage, exhausted and financially strained, faces a terrifying mercenary revolt in North Africa. Rome, taking advantage of Carthaginian weakness, seizes Sardinia and Corsica. From Carthage's perspective, this is not merely opportunism, it is humiliation. A powerful family, the Barcids, turns toward Iberia, where Carthage rebuilds wealth and manpower through conquest. There, in Spain. A boy named Hannibal grows into the shadow of unfinished war. Hannibal becomes one of the few enemies Rome never forgets. He is not simply a brilliant general, he is a psychological event in Roman history. When the Second Punic War begins, he does the unthinkable. Rather than fight where Rome expects, he marches from Iberia through southern Gaul and across the Alps into Italy. The crossing itself becomes legendary men, horses, baggage, and elephants struggling through mountain cold, hostile terrain, and hunger. The exact route remains debated. And no single explanation fully settles the evidence, but the strategic effect is clear. Hannibal appears in Italy like a nightmare from the wrong direction. Then come the defeats at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and finally, Cannae. Roman armies are smashed with terrible skill. Cannae in 216 BCE becomes one of the most studied disasters in military history. Hannibal draws a massive Roman force into encirclement and destroys it. The numbers reported by ancient sources vary and may be inflated, but the slaughter is unquestionably immense. Senators lose relatives. Allied communities watch carefully. Rome faces a question it has faced before. But never on this scale: how much death can the Republic absorb before its political world collapses? The answer, astonishingly, is more than almost anyone expects. Rome refuses to negotiate. This refusal is one of the defining moments of its rise. Many states would seek terms after Cannae. Rome instead changes strategy. Under leaders such as Fabius Maximus, it avoids Hannibal's strengths, harasses him, cuts off support, and denies him the decisive political collapse he needs. The Fabian approach is mocked by some as cowardice, because Romans prefer visible courage to patient avoidance, but survival sometimes requires refusing drama. Hannibal can win battles. He cannot force Rome's alliance system to disintegrate completely. Some Italian allies do defect, including important cities in the south. The danger is real. Yet many remain loyal, whether from fear, calculation, habit, or genuine connection. This is where Rome's earlier conquest of Italy shows its deeper value. The network bends but does not shatter. Colonies hold, Latin allies endure. Rome's manpower system continues functioning under stress that should have broken it. What survives in the record suggests a society traumatized but not paralyzed. The war spreads across theatres Italy, Sicily, Spain, North Africa. Roman commanders slowly grind away Carthaginian positions outside Italy. In Spain, the young Scipio, later called Africanus, proves daring and flexible. Eventually he carries the war to Africa, forcing Hannibal to return home. At Zama in 202 BCE, Rome defeats Carthage decisively. The great invader who spent years in Italy leaves behind no conquered Rome, only memory, fear, and a lesson the Republic absorbs deeply. Enemies must not merely be resisted, they must be made incapable of returning. The peace imposed on Carthage is severe. It loses overseas territories, its navy is restricted, and it must pay heavy indemnities. Yet Carthage survives, and its commercial recovery later alarms Roman hardliners. The Third Punic War, decades later, is less a contest between equals than an execution. Rome besieges Carthage, captures it in 146 BCE, and destroys the city as an independent power. Later stories about sowing the ground with salt are almost certainly not historical. A dramatic image added by later imagination. The actual destruction is brutal enough without embellishment. The city is burned, its people killed or enslaved, and its territory reorganized under Roman control. In the same year Carthage falls, Rome also destroys Corinth and Greece. The symbolism is stark. In 146 BCE, the Republic stamps its authority over both the Western and Eastern Mediterranean worlds. 1 year, 2 ancient centres of wealth and culture humbled. Rome is no longer merely the strongest power in Italy. It is becoming the central force of the Mediterranean, but victory changes the victor. The wealth that flows into Rome after these wars is immense: silver, slaves, art, grain, taxes, and luxury goods. Generals return with triumphs grander than anything earlier citizens could have imagined. Aristocratic competition intensifies as victories abroad bring private prestige and public spectacle. Provinces become fields of opportunity for governors seeking fortunes. Merchants, tax contractors, and financiers find new worlds to exploit. Slaves arrive in such numbers that they begin transforming agriculture and household labour across Italy. For ordinary Romans, the consequences are mixed and often harsh. Long military service can keep small farmers away from their land. Wealthy landowners accumulate estates. Imported grain and slave labour place pressure on traditional rural life. Veterans return to find debts, displacement, or reduced prospects. The Republic has conquered the Mediterranean, but its old social balance begins to strain under the weight of empire. This is the deep irony of the Punic Wars. Rome defeats Carthage because its republican system proves extraordinarily resilient, but the rewards of victory begin to undermine that same system. The habits that saved Rome in crisis military mobilization, elite competition, alliance management, relentless expansion now generate problems the old city-state institutions are poorly equipped to manage. The ruins of Carthage become a warning Rome does not read clearly. A great power can vanish from its own harbour. A city that once commanded seas can become smoke, rubble, and memory. Rome sees in Carthage only a defeated enemy, not a mirror. The Republic stands at its greatest height so far, surrounded by conquered lands and terrified neighbours, yet inside the city, empire is beginning to enter the streets, the courts, the elections, the farms, and the ambitions of men who will soon discover that conquering the world is easier than governing themselves. Empire does not arrive in Rome as a single invading army. It arrives as money, marble, captives, contracts, grain, statues, spices, debts, stories, and expectations. It arrives in the hands of victorious generals and in the ledgers of tax collectors. It arrives in chains, as enslaved people from Greece, Gaul, Spain, Africa, and the eastern Mediterranean are marched into markets and households. It arrives in the kitchens of the rich, in the fields of southern Italy, in the villas spreading across once modest farmland, and in the nervous resentment of citizens who begin to feel that the republic they serve is rewarding someone else. After the defeat of Carthage and the subjugation of major Hellenistic powers, Rome becomes the centre of a widening Mediterranean system. Provincial communities pay taxes. Governors administer distant territories with varying degrees of competence and greed. Merchants and publicani, private tax contractors, turn state power into business. Roman elites acquire Greek artworks, libraries, tutors, philosophies, and tastes. A society that once praises ancestral roughness now debates virtue in houses decorated with imported sculpture. The old ideal of stern simplicity does not vanish, but it becomes harder to believe when the men praising it own estates worked by hundreds of slaves. This tension enters Roman politics like a slow poison. The Republic was built for competition among aristocrats who shared certain assumptions about restraint. Now the prizes of office are larger. A governorship can make a man fabulously wealthy. A military command can bring fame greater than any civic office. A successful general can return not only with honour, but with loyal soldiers, foreign clients, and treasure enough to bend elections. The old rules remain in place. But the stakes have changed. In the countryside, the problem is physical. Rome's early strength depended on citizen farmers, men who could serve in the legions and return to small plots that anchored them to the Republic. But long wars and economic pressure make that model harder to sustain. Many smallholders struggle with debt or absence. Wealthy landowners assemble large estates, often worked by enslaved labour. The details vary by region, and scholars still debate the scale and timing of small farm decline. But the anxiety is real in Roman political memory. Something about the old citizen body feels endangered. The city itself grows more crowded and dependent. People drift toward Rome seeking work, food, legal protection, spectacle, or political opportunity. Urban life becomes louder, riskier, and more unequal. Apartment blocks rise over cramped streets. Fires are common. Grain supply becomes not merely an economic matter, but a political necessity. A hungry crowd in Rome is never just hungry, it is dangerous. Public distributions and subsidized grain gradually become tools of survival and influence. Against this background, reformers emerge from within the elite itself. Tiberius Gracchus, tribune in 133 BCE, attempts to address land concentration by reviving limits on public landholding and redistributing land to citizens. His proposal strikes directly at aristocratic interests. What makes the crisis explosive is not only the law, but the method. Tiberius bypasses Senate opposition by appealing to the popular assembly, uses the tribunate aggressively, and seeks immediate re-election. Supporters see him as defending the people. Opponents see him as threatening the balance of the Republic. No single explanation fully accounts for the violence that follows, but fear of monarchy, class tension, and elite rivalry all converge. Tiberius is killed by senators and their followers in a political riot. This is a fracture point. Roman politics had always been harsh, but the killing of a tribune, a sacrosanct official of the plebs, changes the atmosphere. It teaches a terrible lesson when procedure fails. Violence can decide. A decade later, Gaius Gracchus, Tiberius's younger brother, pushes a broader reform program land issues, grain supply, colonial foundations, judicial reforms, and attempts to reshape the relationship between Senate, equestrians, Italians, and people. Is more systematic, more formidable, and perhaps more dangerous to his enemies. His movement also ends in blood. The Gracchi become symbols that different Romans interpret in opposite ways. To some, they are champions of justice destroyed by oligarchic greed. To others, they are reckless demagogues who destabilize the state. The evidence remains shaped by later political memory, but the consequence is unmistakable. After the Gracchi, the Republic knows that citizens can die in the streets over legislation. The violence does not solve the underlying problems, it only adds precedent. Another pressure builds outside the citizen body, the Italian allies. For generations, they have supplied troops to Rome's armies, shared dangers, and helped build the empire. Yet many lack full Roman citizenship and the political rights attached to it. Reformers periodically consider extending citizenship, but opposition is strong. Roman citizens fear dilution of privilege, elites fear new voters, allies grow increasingly frustrated. The contradiction is obvious and dangerous. Rome has used Italy as the foundation of empire while denying many Italians equal membership in the state that their blood sustains. This unresolved grievance eventually leads to the social war, but even before that explosion, the issue haunts reform politics. Gaius Gracchus understands that the Italian question cannot be ignored forever. His failure reveals Rome's difficulty in adapting its citizenship to the scale of its power. The Republic can conquer widely, but widening political belonging is more difficult than widening rule. Meanwhile, slavery becomes one of empire's most destabilizing foundations. Enslaved labor powers, estates, mines, households, construction, and specialized trades. Some enslaved people are highly educated, others endure horrific conditions, especially in rural gangs and mines. The slave revolts in Sicily during the 2nd century BCE reveal the human cost of Rome's system. These uprisings are not minor disturbances. They involve thousands and require serious military response. Later, the revolt led by Spartacus will terrify Italy even more. What survives in the record suggests both the brutality of enslavement and the vulnerability of a society dependent on coerced labour at enormous scale. A lesser-known but important detail of this world is the role of publicani, private contractors who collect taxes and manage state contracts in provinces. They are not senators, but many belong to the equestrian order, wealthy men below the senatorial elite. In theory, they serve state needs. In practice, provincial taxation can become predatory. Complaints from communities in Asia and elsewhere reveal the darker face of Roman administration. Empire creates new wealth. But not always through orderly governance. Sometimes it is closer to licensed extraction. This reshapes Roman morality. Traditional language still praises duty, moderation, and service. But the daily reality of power encourages opportunism. A governor may squeeze a province to repay election debts. A commander may prolong war for glory. A politician may court the urban crowd with grain laws or games. Opponents accuse one another of corrupting the Republic while participating in the same competitive system. The old civic vocabulary remains powerful precisely because everyone can weaponize it. Culture changes too. Greek philosophy enters elite education. Young aristocrats learn rhetoric from Greek teachers. Roman literature grows in sophistication, often adapting Greek forms into Latin. Conservative voices complain that luxury, foreign habits, and soft living are weakening ancestral virtue. Some of this is moral panic. Older generations often blame decline on imported taste. Yet the anxiety reflects a real transformation. Rome is no longer a rough Latin city commanding nearby allies. It's a Mediterranean capital absorbing the cultures it conquers, sometimes admiring them, sometimes despising them, often doing both at once. The city becomes grander and more unstable. Triumphs display captured kings, exotic animals, piles of treasure, and painted scenes of conquered landscapes. Crowds cheer as generals climb toward the Capitoline in ceremonial splendor. These processions are meant to glorify Rome, but they also glorify individuals. A victorious commander becomes the focus of mass attention, almost sacred for a day. The Republic depends on ambitious men seeking such honor. But empire gives them stages too large for Republican balance. Scholars still debate whether the Republic was already doomed after the Gracchi, or whether alternative paths remained possible. History rarely offers inevitability in clean form. Institutions can survive shocks, reforms can succeed, elites can compromise, but Rome's political culture is becoming less forgiving. Violence has entered public life. Wealth has widened inequality. Armies are becoming tied to long commands and distant theatres. The urban crowd matters more. Italian allies wait impatiently. Provinces feed fortunes. Slaves sustain estates. Every success adds another strain. The Republic has not collapsed. Its Senate still meets. Its magistrates still campaign. Its armies still win. Its citizens still speak of liberty. But the meaning of liberty is becoming contested. For nobles, liberty often means freedom from domination by one man. For common citizens, it may mean protection from debt, hunger, and elite arrogance. For Italian allies, it means citizenship. For enslaved people, Roman liberty means nothing unless it can be seized by flight or revolt. A single word holds incompatible hopes. By the late 2nd century BCE, Rome rules a world its ancestors could barely imagine, yet it has not learned how to share the consequences of that rule. The empire has entered the city, and it will not leave quietly. The next crisis will not come from Carthage or the Greek East, but from Roman soldiers, Roman commanders, and the discovery that the most dangerous armies are the ones that begin to look homeward. The Republic's deepest wound opens when soldiers begin to look beyond the state and toward the man who pays, rewards, and leads them. At first, this shift does not appear as treason. It appears as reform, necessity, and military adaptation. Rome's wars have grown too long and too distant for the old citizen-farmer ideal to function cleanly. Campaigns in Spain, North Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean demand endurance across years, not seasons. Poor citizens, displaced farmers, and men with little property still have bodies strong enough to fight. But the older property qualifications sit awkwardly beside Rome's need for manpower. Into this pressure steps Gaius Marius, a new kind of Roman hero, rough-edged, ambitious, and proud of arising by ability rather than ancient nobility. Marius wins glory in the war against Jugurtha, the clever Numidian king whose resistance exposes corruption among Roman elites. The conflict in North Africa is not Rome's greatest war by scale, but politically it matters because it convinces many citizens that aristocratic command has become selfish and incompetent. Marius presents himself as the corrective discipline, practical, military, less polished than the old nobility, and therefore supposedly more honest. His recruitment of poorer volunteers is often treated as a decisive revolution. Scholars still debate how sudden and formal the so-called Marian reforms really were, but the larger transformation is clear. Soldiers increasingly expect land, money, and security after service, and the general who can deliver those rewards becomes more than a commander. He becomes a patron. That change quietly alters loyalty. A legionary may still fight for Rome, but his future depends on the man who leads him. If the Senate refuses veteran settlements, a general can claim to defend his troops against an ungrateful state. The army becomes a political instrument wrapped in legitimate grievance. Rome has created soldiers whose hopes can be mobilized inside Roman politics. Marius's victories against invading northern peoples, especially the Cimbrian Teutones, make him a saviour figure. Fear of these groups shakes Italy deeply. Roman defeats in the north revive old nightmares of the Gallic sack, that ancestral memory of northern warriors breaking into the city. Marius defeats them and earns repeated consulships, bending tradition under the pressure of emergency. Rome cheers survival, but the Republic pays a constitutional price. Extraordinary success makes extraordinary offers holding seem acceptable. Then comes Lucius Cornelius Sulla, aristocratic, brilliant, cold, and more dangerous because he understands both tradition and force. His rivalry with Marius grows from competition into civil conflict. The immediate spark is command against Mithridates VI of Pontus, a formidable eastern king whose war against Rome includes the massacre of Roman and Italian residents in Asia Minor. Command against Mithridates promises glory and wealth. When political maneuvering transfers that command from Sulla to Marius, Sulla does something almost unthinkable. He marches his army on Rome. This is one of the great threshold moments in Roman history. Armies have defended the city, threatened enemies, and crushed revolts. But a Roman commander leading Roman troops into Rome itself breaks an invisible barrier. The Republic has many laws, but it also depends on habits no law can fully enforce. Sulla shows that an army loyal to its general can overpower the sacred geography of politics. Once this is demonstrated, it cannot be undiscovered. The civil violence that follows is bitter and intimate. Marius returns to power amid bloodshed. Sulla later returns from the east and takes Rome again. Proscriptions follow lists of enemies whose lives and property are declared forfeit. Men are hunted, killed, dispossessed. Political murder becomes administrative. Heads appear in public spaces as warnings. Sulla claims to restore the Republic by strengthening the Senate and weakening popular offices, especially the tribunate. Then, in one of history's stranger gestures, he resigns extraordinary power and retires. The act seems to prove that he is not a king, yet the damage is already done. He has shown that one can seize the state by force and call it restoration. A lesser known but chilling detail of Sulla's settlement lies in the way confiscated lands are used to settle veterans across Italy. Communities that supported his enemies are punished. Soldiers receive land, but local resentment remains. The civil war does not vanish when armies disband, it sinks into property lines, memories, and ruined families. Rome's political violence becomes embedded in the countryside. The next generation grows up under that shadow. Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar all inherit a republic whose rules still exist but whose sanctity has weakened. Pompey rises young through military command, earning triumphs before holding the normal offices and the normal order, so Crassus builds immense wealth and helps crush the revolt of Spartacus, a rebellion that reveals again the terror beneath Rome's slave economy. Caesar, born into ancient patrician lineage but burdened by debt and ambition, learns to move through popularity, spectacle, priesthood, alliance, and calculated risk. Spartacus deserves a pause because his revolt exposes a Rome that official triumphs prefer to hide. Beginning among gladiators in Capua in 73 BCE, the rebellion grows into a massive movement of enslaved and desperate people moving through Italy, defeating Roman forces and alarming the entire peninsula. Ancient sources, written from the viewpoint of slaveholding society, do not preserve the rebels' inner world with fairness. The evidence remains incomplete. But the scale of the revolt suggests both extraordinary leadership and a deep reservoir of suffering. Crassus eventually crushes the uprising, and thousands of survivors are crucified along the Appian Way. The road that symbolizes Roman order becomes a corridor of warning. The Republic responds to such crises by empowering exceptional men, then pretending the exceptions have not changed the system. Pompey receives vast commands against pirates and in the east. His war against piracy is especially revealing. Mediterranean piracy threatens grain supply, trade, and Roman prestige. Pompey is granted sweeping authority across enormous territories and defeats the pirates quickly, partly through military action and partly by resettlement. It is efficient, impressive, and constitutionally alarming. Rome needs results, extraordinary command provides them. The old system bends again. The first triumvirate, though not an official office, emerges from this bending. Pompey wants land for veterans and ratification of his eastern settlements. Crassus wants financial advantages for his allies. Caesar wants consulship and future command. Together, they form a private alliance powerful enough to dominate public politics. It is not monarchy, it is not yet dictatorship. It is something more Roman and more corrosive private interests using public institutions as instruments. Caesar's command in Gaul transforms everything. Over nearly a decade, he wages campaigns that bring vast territories under Roman control, produce staggering casualties and enslavement, and make him enormously wealthy and famous. His own writings present the war with controlled clarity, but they are also political self-defense. Modern scholars continue to debate details of his numbers, motives, and descriptions. What remains undeniable is the result. Caesar commands veteran legions personally loyal to him. He has military glory equal to or greater than Pompey's. He has enemies in Rome who fear prosecution if he returns as a private citizen. The logic of confrontation tightens. The crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BCE is remembered because it makes geography symbolic. A small river in northern Italy marks the boundary beyond which Caesar cannot legally bring his army. By crossing it, he turns political conflict into civil war. The moment is often surrounded by dramatic phrases in later tradition, but its power does not require embellishment. A Roman general chooses armed defiance over submission to his rivals. Once again, the Republic's fate rests not in assemblies or courts, but in the movement of legions. Pompey and the Senate's forces eventually lose. Caesar becomes dictator, then dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. He reforms calendars, settles veterans, grants citizenship, plans campaigns, accepts honours, and concentrates authority. To supporters, he brings order after chaos and mercy after civil war. To opponents, he is the very nightmare Rome has feared since the expulsion of the kings, one man standing above the Republic. The evidence suggests Caesar understood power with extraordinary intelligence, but perhaps underestimated how deeply Roman aristocrats hated the appearance of monarchy. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, conspirators assassinate him in a Senate meeting. They imagine, or claim to imagine, that killing the tyrant will restore liberty. It does not. The Republic has already lost the habits required to survive such a shock. Caesar's murder creates martyrs, heirs, armies, and another round of civil war. Brutus and Cassius speak the language of freedom, but they too command armies. Mark Antony uses Caesar's memory as a weapon. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, young and underestimated, enters politics with a cold patience that will eventually outmatch them all. The final wars of the Republic are less about restoring old institutions than about deciding which commander will dominate them. Philippi destroys the assassins. The uneasy partnership of Antony and Octavian decays into propaganda, suspicion, and war. Cleopatra of Egypt becomes central to the conflict not simply as a romantic figure, as later imagination prefers, but as a ruler of immense wealth and strategic importance. Octavian frames the struggle as Rome against Eastern excess. Though it is truly another Roman civil war, at Actium in 31 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra are defeated. In Egypt, they die. The last great Hellenistic kingdom falls under Roman control. Octavian returns as the victor of a century of internal ruin. The Republic is exhausted, the Senate remains, magistracies remain, elections remain in form, but everyone understands that peace now depends on one man having enough power to prevent others from fighting over it. The Romans still hate kings. Octavian knows this, so he will not call himself king. He will build something subtler, stronger, and more enduring monarchy disguised as restoration. Octavian returns to Rome carrying victory carefully, as if it is something sharp that might cut the hand holding it. He has defeated Antony, absorbed Egypt, inherited Caesar's name, and outlasted nearly every rival who once seemed more experienced, more charismatic, or more dangerous. Yet he understands what Caesar did not fully solve. Rome will accept domination if it is dressed as rescue. It will endure monarchy if monarchy refuses to use the forbidden word. The city has been wounded by proscriptions, confiscations, assassinations, shifting alliances, and battlefields filled with Roman dead. People are tired enough to welcome order, but proud enough to require the language of liberty. So Octavian gives them that language. In 27 BCE, he stages what later generations remember as the restoration of the Republic. He formally returns extraordinary powers to the Senate and Roman people. In response, the Senate grants him honours, provinces, authority, and a new name Augustus. The title carries religious and moral weight, suggesting something elevated, consecrated, more than merely political. He becomes not king, not dictator, but princeps, the first man of the state. The old offices remain visible. Consuls are still elected, senators still meet, laws still pass through recognisable channels. Coins and monuments speak of peace, restoration, and ancestral virtue, but beneath the surface, the decisive powers gather around Augustus. This is the genius of the Augustan settlement. It does not abolish the Republic. It empties the most dangerous parts of Republican competition, while preserving the shell that makes Roman elites feel they still inhabit the world of their ancestors. Augustus controls key provinces, especially those with major armies. He holds tribunician power, allowing him to present himself as protector of the people. He gains authority over legislation, foreign policy, military command, and succession without needing to call himself a monarch. Scholars still debate how consciously designed every stage of this system was, because Augustus improvises as well as plans, but the result is unmistakable. The Republic survives in vocabulary. Power has become imperial. The city itself becomes part of the performance. Augustus boasts, in later memory, that he found Rome brick and left it marble. The phrase is polished propaganda, but the transformation is real. Temples are restored. New monuments rise. Public spaces are reorganized around order, piety, and dynastic memory. The Forum of Augustus, with its Temple of Mars altar, presents vengeance for Caesar and victory over chaos as sacred foundations of peace. Statues of great Romans from the past fill the space, silently placing Augustus within a lineage of Republican heroes, even as he ends the political world that produced them. Architecture becomes argument. Marble tells citizens that the gods have approved the new age. Arches, altars, theatres, porticos, and temples make stability visible. After decades of civil war, stone itself seems calming. The message is simple, but powerful under Augustus. Rome is not falling apart. Rome is becoming what it was always meant to be. Yet the peace is not gentle everywhere. The famous Pax Romana, the Roman peace, begins with victory and control. Frontiers must be secured, rebellions must be suppressed, taxes must be collected, soldiers must be paid, provinces must learn the new rhythm of imperial rule. In some regions, Roman order brings roads, markets, urban development, legal structures, and protection from rival powers. In others, it brings heavy demands, cultural disruption, and violent punishment. Peace, in empire, often means that resistance has been made too costly. Augustus knows the army is the foundation beneath everything. He reduces and reorganizes the legions after civil war, settles veterans, creates a more permanent military structure, and establishes financial arrangements for soldiers' retirement. This is one of the least romantic but most important achievements of his rule. The Republic failed partly because armies became personal tools of ambitious commanders. Augustus tries to make the army belong to the imperial system, which in practice means to himself and his successors. The solution works, but it carries a hidden danger. Whoever controls the army controls the empire. The problem is not removed, it is centralized. Succession is the other unsolved problem. Augustus cannot openly create hereditary monarchy without exposing the fiction of restoration. Yet he must ensure continuity, because a system built around one man risks collapse when that man dies. His family becomes a political instrument. Marriages are arranged, heirs are promoted, adopted, displayed, and mourned. One by one, promising successors die Marcellus, Agrippa, Gaius, Lucius. The imperial household becomes a place where private grief and state anxiety merge. Livia, Augustus's wife, emerges as one of the most important figures in the regime. Though later sources colour her with suspicion shaped by gendered fears of female influence, the evidence remains incomplete, but her prominence reveals that the new monarchy depends not only on offices, but on family management. A lesser-known detail of Augustan control lies in the moral legislation. Augustus attempts to regulate marriage, adultery, childbearing, and elite family behaviour. This may seem almost intimate compared with armies and provinces, but it fits his larger project. Rome's crisis is presented not merely as political failure, but as moral decay. The old virtues must be restored, families must reproduce, elites must behave as if ancestral discipline still governs them. The irony is sharp. A revolutionary regime born from civil war now claims to restore ancient purity by law. The most painful example is Augustus's own daughter, Julia, exiled for sexual scandal and political embarrassment. Her punishment reveals the cold demands of image. The ruler who presents himself as guardian of family virtue cannot tolerate disorder in his own household, especially when that household is part of the state's symbolic architecture. Rome's public morality is built partly by sacrificing private people to imperial necessity. Poets and writers help shape the atmosphere of the age. Virgil, Horace, Livy, Ovid, and others write within a world where patronage, memory, politics, and art are entwined. Virgil's great epic links Rome's destiny to Trojan suffering, divine command, and the long road toward Augustan peace. Livy writes the history of Rome from its beginnings, preserving stories of courage, discipline, sacrifice, and decline. These works are not simple propaganda, but neither are they detached from power. They give Rome a past suitable for its new present. They make empire feel ancient, fated, and morally serious. Ovid proves that artistic brilliance can still collide with imperial authority. His exile to the Black Sea under Augustus remains partly mysterious. He refers to a poem and an error, but the details are uncertain. Scholars still debate the cause. What matters for the larger story is the atmosphere even in a polished golden age. The princeps can send a poet to the edge of the world. The mask of republican restraint does not prevent imperial punishment. The provinces experience Augustus differently from Rome. in Gaul, Spain, Asia Minor, North Africa, Syria, and Egypt. Imperial rule takes local forms. Cities honour Augustus with temples and inscriptions. Local elites compete for Roman favour. Roads and administrative systems deepen integration. Taxation becomes more regular in some regions. The imperial cult grows, allowing communities to express loyalty through worship-like honours directed toward Rome and the emperor's divine associations. To modern ears, this can sound strange, but in the ancient world, politics and religion often meet naturally. Honouring Augustus as a sacred figure helps bind distant communities to the centre. Egypt holds a special place. After Antony and Cleopatra's defeat, it becomes not an ordinary senatorial province but the emperor's personal domain, governed by a prefect of equestrian rank. Senators are restricted from entering without permission. Egypt's grain is too important, its wealth too great, its symbolic power too dangerous. The old kingdom of the pharaohs becomes a crucial support of Roman imperial survival. Grain ships from Alexandria help feed the capital. A land older than Rome's legends now sustains Rome's present. Still, Augustus cannot make the empire invulnerable. In 9 CE, in the Teutoburg forest, Germanic forces under Arminius destroy 3 Roman legions commanded by Varus. The disaster shocks Rome profoundly. It halts ambitions for deeper conquest east of the Rhine and reveals that imperial expansion has limits. Ancient sources describe Augustus grieving the lost legions, though the emotional details may be shaped by later storytelling. Strategically, the message is clear: Rome can still be defeated. Forests, local knowledge, overconfidence, and betrayal can undo imperial planning. The empire may be vast, but it is not infinite. This defeat gives the Augustan age a darker edge. The same regime that presents peace and destiny also learns caution. Frontiers become not merely lines of advance, but zones of management. Diplomacy, client kings, forts, roads, and military presence all form part of a new imperial geography. Rome rules most effectively where conquest can be converted into administration, where terrain, distance, and resistance make that conversion too costly. Even Rome hesitates. When Augustus dies in 14 CE, the system faces its first great test. He has ruled so long that many Romans have no adult memory of real republican politics. The mask has become familiar. The Senate honours him, deifies him, and transfers power to Tiberius, his adopted son. There is uncertainty, discomfort, and careful theatre, but no restoration of the old republic. The empire continues. That continuation is Augustus's greatest victory. He turns exhaustion into obedience, monarchy into tradition, and civil war into a founding memory of peace. Yet the structure he leaves behind contains all the tensions of its birth. It depends on one ruler, but pretends to preserve shared government. It needs the army, but fears military ambition. It celebrates moral order, but lives inside dynastic intrigue. It offers peace, but rests on conquest. It claims restoration, but creates something new. Rome has entered its imperial age, not by forgetting the Republic, but by wearing its face like a mask. Beneath that mask, roads lengthen, aqueducts flow, provincial cities rise, soldiers stand watch on frontiers, and ordinary people across the empire begin living inside a Roman world that seems, for a time, almost permanent. At dawn, Rome wakes in layers. In the wealthy districts, shutters open onto courtyards cooled by fountains and shaded by painted colonnades. Slaves sweep mosaic floors before their owners rise. Bread arrives still warm from bakeries already crowded since the night hours. In poorer neighbourhoods, entire families stir inside cramped upper rooms where smoke, heat, and noise settle into the walls. Below them, wagons rattle over stone streets, dogs bark, vendors shout prices. And somewhere nearby, a shrine receives a quick offering from someone hoping the gods will make the day less difficult than the last. The empire looks different depending on where one stands within it. For senators moving through marble halls, Rome is authority, ancestry, and performance. For a merchant in Alexandria, it is taxation and opportunity carried by grain ships across the Mediterranean. For a soldier posted near the Rhine, it is cold rain, timber forts, and years spent far from Italy. For a farmer in Gaul, it may be roads, new markets, military demands, and unfamiliar laws slowly blending with older customs. For an enslaved tutor in an aristocratic household, Rome is both cultural admiration and personal captivity. The empire holds together because millions of people experience it differently, while still moving inside the same political structure. The city of Rome remains the symbolic centre of this immense world, even after later emperors spend increasing time elsewhere. During the early imperial centuries, its population may approach or exceed 1 million people. Though ancient population estimates are notoriously difficult and scholars continue debating the numbers, even at lower estimates, the city is enormous by ancient standards. Feeding it requires constant movement across sea and land. Grain from Egypt and North Africa becomes essential. Harbours, warehouses, barges, and distribution systems work continuously to prevent shortage and unrest. The grain supply is so important that emperors treat it almost like a military matter. A disruption in shipments can produce panic quickly. Crowds gather, rumours spread, political stability feels suddenly fragile. Rome's greatness depends on invisible routines functioning correctly every day, ships arriving on time, aqueducts flowing, taxes collected, roads maintained, and officials competent enough to prevent interruption. Aqueducts themselves become one of the Empire's defining achievements. They carry water across astonishing distances using carefully controlled gradients so subtle they are nearly invisible to the eye. Some run underground for much of their length. Others stride across valleys on towering arches. Fresh water feeds baths, fountains, workshops, gardens, and wealthy homes. Public fountains allow ordinary citizens access to water that would have seemed miraculous in many ancient cities. Yet these systems require endless maintenance. Sediment builds, pipes crack, theft occurs. Roman infrastructure appears eternal in ruins today, partly because generations of labour once kept it alive constantly. Baths are among the most revealing places in Roman life. They are not simply locations for washing. Large bath complexes include exercise spaces, libraries, gardens, meeting areas, heated rooms, cold plunges, and social zones where politics, gossip, business, and philosophy mix with steam and sweat. Rich and poor alike may enter, though not equally. The baths display Roman confidence in engineering and public life. Heat circulates beneath floors through hypocaust systems. Walls gleam with marble and coloured stone. Visitors move through carefully designed sequences of temperature and atmosphere. To many Romans, civilization itself feels warm, ordered, and collective. Yet just beyond these grand spaces stand the insulum, crowded apartment blocks where much of the urban population lives. Ancient writers complain about collapsing buildings, dangerous stairways, thin walls, noise, smoke, and fire hazards. Wealthy Romans often own these buildings as investments while rarely living inside them. Upper floors are cheaper and less desirable because carrying water upward is difficult and escaping danger harder. The poor climb highest. A city that dazzles visitors with monuments also traps many residents in precarious daily existence. Food reflects both inequality and connection. Ordinary diets rely heavily on grain, olive oil, wine, legumes, vegetables, and fish sauce known as garum, a fermented condiment so widespread that factories producing it operate across the empire. Wealthier tables display imported luxuries, oysters, spices, exotic animals, fine wines, and elaborately prepared dishes meant to demonstrate status as much as provide nourishment. Roman satire often mocks elite excess. Describing banquets where performance overwhelms appetite, behind the humour lies unease. An empire built on conquest now consumes the world at dinner. Religion fills public and private spaces simultaneously. Household shrines honour protective spirits and ancestors. Temples dominate civic centres. Festivals interrupt ordinary routines with sacrifice, procession, games, and ritual. Priests interpret signs, maintain calendars, and supervise ceremonies. At the same time, new cults and foreign deities spread through imperial networks. Isis from Egypt, Mithras associated with Persian traditions, local Celtic gods fused with Roman identities. All find followers within the empire. Roman religion is remarkably absorbent. Rather than replacing old gods entirely, Rome often layers divinities together, translating local powers into Roman forms. This flexibility helps the empire govern diversity, but it also creates tension when groups resist participation in shared ritual life. Judaism occupies a distinctive position, ancient and respected in some ways, yet periodically viewed with suspicion because of its strong monotheistic traditions and resistance to certain imperial religious expectations. Later, Christianity emerges from this environment as a small movement within the eastern provinces, at first almost invisible against the vast religious landscape of the empire. The Roman road system ties these worlds together physically. Roads are built with drainage, layered foundations, milestones, and military logic. They allow armies to move rapidly but also carry merchants, officials, letters, pilgrims, entertainers, and ideas. Some famous roads remain visible today because Roman engineering prioritizes durability and maintenance. Yet the roads are not merely technological achievements, they are instruments of integration. A traveller can move from Britain to Syria through landscapes increasingly marked by Roman administration, law, and urban form. Cities become Rome's fingerprints across the empire. Forums, baths, amphitheatres, temples, and grids appear from North Africa to Western Europe. Local elites often sponsor these projects enthusiastically because Roman-style urban life brings prestige and political advancement. In many regions, becoming Roman is less about abandoning local identity entirely than adding another layer to it. A provincial aristocrat may speak Latin in official settings, worship local gods alongside Roman ones, and serve imperial administration while remaining deeply tied to regional traditions. Language itself reveals the unevenness of empire. Latin dominates administration in the West, while Greek remains enormously influential in the Eastern Mediterranean. Educated Romans often know Greek literature and philosophy intimately. In the East, Greek-speaking cities continue intellectual traditions older than Rome's rise. The empire is politically unified but culturally varied. This diversity is one reason it proves so resilient for centuries. The army remains the backbone beneath everything. Legionaries spend years stationed on frontiers far from home. Forts along the Rhine, Danube, Euphrates, and North African deserts become semi-permanent communities with workshops, shrines, bathhouses, families nearby, and local economies tied to military spending. Soldiers build roads, bridges, walls, and camps as much as they fight battles. auxiliary troops recruited from non-citizen populations serve alongside legions, often gaining citizenship after long service. In this way, military life becomes another engine of Romanization. A lesser-known detail from frontier life reveals how personal these distant worlds can feel. Archaeologists at sites like Vindolanda near Hadrian's Wall in Britain have uncovered writing tablets preserving ordinary correspondence invitations to birthday celebrations, supply requests, complaints about cold weather, list of socks and sandals needed by soldiers. These fragile scraps survive by accident in unusual soil conditions, and they collapse the distance between modern observer and ancient individual. Empire is not only emperors and wars, it is someone on a rainy frontier asking a friend not to forget warmer clothing. Entertainment binds society together while also distracting it. Gladiatorial games, chariot races, theatrical performances, and public spectacles attract enormous crowds. The Colosseum, completed under the Flavian emperors, becomes the ultimate expression of imperial entertainment culture. Tens of thousands gather to watch combat, animal hunts, executions, and staged displays of power. Modern reactions to gladiatorial violence often focus on brutality, and rightly so. But to Romans, these spectacles also communicate hierarchy, discipline, courage, punishment, generosity, and imperial abundance. The emperor who provides games demonstrates control over life, death, and resources. Still, beneath the spectacle lies constant vulnerability. Disease spreads quickly in crowded cities connected by trade routes. Fire can erase entire districts. Frontier invasions remain possible. Crops fail. Political rumours race through urban populations. The empire's size creates strength, but also dependence. Everything relies on movement grain, taxes, soldiers, information, loyalty. For many inhabitants, however, the imperial centuries bring relative stability compared with earlier eras of fragmented warfare. Trade flourishes. Travel becomes safer in many regions. Legal systems create predictable frameworks for contracts and disputes. Cities expand. Literacy spreads unevenly but significantly among elites and administrative classes. Roman citizenship gradually extends more broadly until, under Caracalla in 212 CE, nearly all free inhabitants of the empire formally receive it. By then, Rome is less a city ruling foreigners than a vast imperial identity encompassing peoples who would once have been enemies. And yet the empire's calm surface conceals pressures accumulating slowly. Armies expect payment and rewards. Emperors must maintain legitimacy constantly. Succession remains uncertain. Wealth disparities deepen. Frontier pressures shift. Epidemics occasionally sweep through trade networks. Climate patterns fluctuate in ways ancient people cannot fully understand. At its height, Rome feels eternal precisely because daily life continues so reliably. Water flows, roads function, soldiers stand watch, markets open, temples smoke with sacrifice, crowds cheer in the circus, ships enter harbour, laws are copied, children learn Latin verses. Somewhere in the empire, a mason carves another imperial inscription into stone as though the order surrounding him will last forever. That confidence becomes one of Rome's greatest achievements. It also becomes one of its most dangerous illusions. Power at the centre of Rome is never still. It moves through marble halls, military camps, family bedrooms, senate meetings, palace corridors, and whispered accusations. The empire may look orderly from a distance, but the person at its summit stands in a dangerous place. An emperor must be commander or a judge, priest, benefactor, symbol, heir of Augustus, guardian of peace, master of armies, and performer of restraint. He must appear powerful enough to command the world, but not so nakedly royal that Roman memory turns against him. The balance is exhausting, and not every ruler can maintain it. Tiberius inherits Augustus's system with reluctance and suspicion. He is experienced, capable, and deeply uncomfortable beneath the theatrical burden of imperial rule. Ancient writers often portray him as gloomy, secretive, and increasingly cruel, though their accounts are shaped by senatorial hostility and moral judgment. What survives suggests a reign that begins with administrative competence, but darkens under fear, treason trials, and isolation. The new system has survived Augustus's death. But it has also revealed a hard truth: Rome now depends on the character, health, paranoia, and household politics of one man. Caligula, Claudius, and Nero make that truth impossible to ignore. The Julio-Claudian dynasty becomes a study in how imperial power can magnify personality. Caligula's brief rule is remembered for extravagance, humiliation of elites, and possible mental instability, though separating fact from hostile exaggeration remains difficult. Claudius, underestimated because of physical disabilities and courtly awkwardness, proves unexpectedly effective in administration and conquest. Especially with the invasion of Britain in 43 CE, Nero begins under guidance, then sinks into artistic obsession, elite terror, financial pressure, and political isolation. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE becomes attached permanently to his name, even though the famous image of him casually making music while the city burns is more legend than evidence. Still, his rebuilding projects and persecution of Christians after the fire reveal how disaster, rumour, and imperial image collide. When Nero dies in 68 CE, the dynasty of Augustus ends. The year that follows tears away another illusion. In 69 CE, 4 emperors rise in rapid succession: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian. Armies in different provinces make and unmake rulers. Rome learns again what had been true since the late Republic, but carefully hidden under Augustan theatre, the legions decide legitimacy when politics fails. Vespasian, founder of the Flavian dynasty, restores stability not by returning to old Republican freedom, but by grounding imperial power openly in military victory, discipline, and practical administration. The Flavians understand spectacle. The Colosseum rises on land once claimed by Nero's extravagant palace, turning private imperial excess into public entertainment. The message is brilliant. What one emperor took for himself, the new dynasty gives to the Roman people, but the amphitheatre also reveals the darker splendour of imperial rule. Exotic animals are slaughtered, condemned prisoners die for crowds, gladiators risk death beneath organised cheers. Rome turns violence into architecture. A lesser-known detail from this period is the empire's dependence on carefully managed memory. Emperors can be condemned after death through damnatio memoriae, the official or semi-official erasure of honours, names and images. Statues are reworked, inscriptions are chiselled away, portraits are altered into the faces of new rulers. This is not perfect erasure. Traces remain, sometimes visibly scarred into stone. Rome tries to control memory, yet the damage itself becomes evidence. Even forgetting leaves marks. After the turbulence of the 1st century, the empire enters a period later remembered as one of its most stable ages, under rulers such as Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. The phrase 5 good emperors is a later simplification, but it captures a real contrast with earlier dynastic chaos. Succession by adoption, or at least by carefully chosen heirs, seems to offer a solution to hereditary weakness. Trajan expands the empire to its greatest territorial extent with the conquest of Dacia and campaigns in the east. His column in Rome spirals upward with carved scenes of war, engineering, sacrifice, submission, and imperial order, a stone documentary of conquest carefully composed to glorify the emperor. Hadrian turns from expansion toward consolidation. He travels constantly, inspects provinces, reorganises defences, sponsors building, and marks limits. Hadrian's Wall in Britain becomes one of the most famous frontiers in history, not simply a barrier against invasion, but a controlled military zone of forts, gates, roads, customs, and surveillance. It states that Rome has edges. This is not weakness, it is maturity. An empire that knows its limits may survive longer than one always chasing the horizon. Yet even in this admired age, uncertainty remains. The evidence from provincial life suggests both prosperity and pressure. Cities flourish, but they depend on elite generosity and imperial favour. Frontiers are quiet in some decades and tense in others. Legal protections expand for some, while slavery and hierarchy remain fundamental. The empire is impressive, but not utopian. Its peace is uneven. Marcus Aurelius, remembered as the philosopher-emperor, rules during hardship rather than serenity. His private reflections, written in Greek during campaigns, reveal a mind trying to maintain discipline amid illness, war, fatigue, and mortality. The Antonine Plague, likely brought into the empire by troops returning from the east, spreads devastation across regions. The exact disease remains debated, with smallpox often proposed but not proven beyond all doubt. Its demographic and economic effects are difficult to measure precisely, yet ancient testimony and modern analysis agree that it was severe. Even a powerful empire can be weakened by organisms too small for any legion to see. The reign of Marcus also brings long wars along the Danube. Peoples beyond the frontier press into imperial territory, driven by their own pressures that Roman sources only partially understand. Rome still wins, but victory becomes more expensive. The emperor spends years away from the capital. The image of calm imperial philosophy sits beside camps, cold weather, disease, and exhausted soldiers. Splendour and strain now share the same throne. Then comes Commodus, Marcus's son, and the old problem of succession returns. Commodus's reign is remembered for self-indulgence, gladiatorial performance, and political instability. Ancient senatorial sources despise him, and some details may be exaggerated, but his assassination in 192 CE ends the Antonine order and opens another violent scramble for power. Once more, Rome discovers that a stable century does not abolish the danger built into imperial monarchy. The Severan dynasty that follows is openly military in character. Septimius Severus wins power through civil war and strengthens the army's position. His reported advice to his sons, to enrich the soldiers and scorn everyone else, may be shaped by later tradition, but it fits the direction of the age. The emperor increasingly depends on military loyalty purchased with pay, privilege, and attention. This does not mean civilian administration vanishes. Roman law and bureaucracy continue developing impressively, but the balance tilts. The army is no longer merely the empire's defender, it is the empire's kingmaker. Power, fear, and splendour therefore grow together. The same state that builds magnificent baths, roads, forums, and legal systems also produces palace murders, purges, military coups, and public executions. An emperor may be worshipped in provincial temples and murdered by his guards. His face may appear on millions of coins one year and be erased from monuments the next. The empire's centre is dazzling, but the dazzle reflects instability as much as confidence. No single explanation fully accounts for why some emperors govern effectively and others become disasters. Personality matters, but so do succession, military pressure, elite cooperation, finances, disease, frontier conditions, and chance. Rome's imperial system can absorb mediocre rulers when institutions and circumstances are strong. It becomes far more vulnerable when bad leadership meets external strain. By the early 3rd century, that dangerous overlap is drawing closer. The empire still appears immense. Its cities still function. Its roads still carry soldiers and merchants. Its laws still shape daily life. But the cost of holding everything together is rising. The frontiers are no longer distant edges of glory. They are lines of pressure. The armies that defend them are increasingly expensive and politically decisive. The silver in the coinage begins to tell its own quiet story of strain. And somewhere beyond Rome's borders, peoples who once seemed manageable are changing too. The empire has not fallen. It has not even clearly begun to fall. But the old confidence has thinned. Beneath the marble, beneath the ceremonies, beneath the emperor's image stamped on metal and stone, Rome is becoming harder to govern than it is to admire. The pressure begins slowly enough that many people probably mistake it for ordinary trouble. Frontiers have always required defence, emperors have always faced conspiracies, cities have always suffered fires, shortages, and outbreaks of disease. Rome has endured civil wars before and emerged stronger. That memory of survival becomes dangerous because it encourages the belief that every crisis is temporary. But during the 3rd century, the empire enters a period when disasters stop arriving one at a time. They begin arriving together. The frontiers along the Rhine and Danube grow increasingly unstable. Beyond them, tribal confederations become larger, more mobile, and more capable of coordinated pressure. Roman writers often describe these peoples with broad labels such as Goths, Alemanni, Franks, and Vandals. Though the reality behind the names is fluid, identities shift, alliances form and dissolve, groups absorb outsiders, split apart, migrate, and reorganize. The empire faces not one enemy, but changing populations reacting to climate fluctuations, political opportunities, trade connections, and pressures farther east that Romans only dimly understand. At the same time, the East becomes more dangerous. The old Parthian Empire is replaced by the Sasanian Persian Empire in the 3rd century, and the new Persian rulers are aggressive, centralized, and ambitious. Unlike smaller frontier raids, Persia represents a true imperial rival, wealthy and organized enough to threaten Roman provinces seriously. Roman armies now face pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously, stretching resources thinner each decade. Then comes the succession crisis. Emperors rise and fall with dizzying speed. Generals proclaimed by their troops march against rivals. Assassinations become almost routine. Some emperors rule for only months before dying violently. Others never even reach Rome. The empire enters what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, though people living through it cannot know whether they are inside a temporary storm or the beginning of something irreversible. What survives in the record suggests a world where uncertainty spreads into everyday life. Armies demand higher pay and bonuses to secure loyalty. To meet these costs, emperors debase the coinage, reducing the precious metal content in silver coins. Inflation follows, prices become unstable, confidence in currency weakens, trade networks still function, but less reliably. Local communities increasingly rely on self-protection because imperial response can no longer be assumed to arrive quickly. The economy does not collapse uniformly across the empire, and scholars still debate the scale of decline in different regions. Some cities remain prosperous, certain trade routes continue thriving, but the pattern of instability is unmistakable. The empire's systems are becoming less predictable. Plague worsens the strain. Around the middle of the 3rd century, another major epidemic, often called the Plague of Cyprian after the bishop who described it, spreads through the empire. The exact disease remains uncertain. Ancient descriptions mention fever, weakness, vomiting, and prolonged suffering. Mortality may have been severe in some regions. Modern historians argue over numbers, but the psychological effect alone must have been profound. Armies weaken, labour shortages appear. Fear spreads through crowded urban populations already anxious from war and political violence. There is something haunting about Rome during this era because the empire still looks magnificent from a distance. The great buildings still stand, aqueducts still carry water, senators still wear ancient robes, coins still bear imperial portraits proclaiming victory and eternity, yet underneath the familiar surfaces the machinery of government is beginning to seize. One extraordinary event captures the shock of the age. In 260 CE, the Emperor Valerian is captured alive by the Persian king Shapur I after defeat in the east. No Roman emperor had ever suffered such humiliation. Later stories claim Shapur used Valerian as a human footstool, though these accounts may be exaggerated or shaped by hostile propaganda. Even without embellishment, the fact itself is astonishing. The ruler of the Roman world becomes a prisoner of a foreign monarch. For Romans raised on centuries of imperial superiority, the psychological impact must have been immense. At the same time, parts of the empire begin slipping into semi-independence. In the west, the Gallic Empire emerges under Postumus, controlling Gaul, Britain, and parts of Hispania for years. In the east, the city of Palmyra under Queen Zenobia creates its own sphere of authority stretching across wealthy eastern provinces. These breakaway states still present themselves as Roman in many ways. They mint coins, govern cities, and maintain administrative structures. This is not yet the replacement of Rome by foreign kingdoms. It is fragmentation within the Roman world itself. Palmyra is especially fascinating because it embodies the empire's cultural complexity. Rising from the Syrian desert, enriched by caravan trade linking Rome, Persia, and Arabia, the city blends Roman, Greek, and Near Eastern influences. Under Zenobia, Palmyra briefly becomes powerful enough to challenge imperial authority directly. Ancient accounts later romanticize her intelligence and ambition, though they are shaped by Roman attitudes toward gender and foreign rulers. Her defeat by the Emperor Aurelian restores formal unity, but the episode reveals how regional power can flourish when the centre weakens. Aurelian himself becomes one of the empire's great emergency rulers. He defeats rivals, reunifies the fractured empire, strengthens defences, and surrounds Rome with massive new walls, many sections of which still stand today. The Aurelian walls reveal something profound. For centuries, Rome itself had largely lived without major defensive walls because its rulers believed enemies would be stopped far from the capital. Now the city prepares for danger directly. The psychological geography of empire changes. The centre no longer feels untouchable. A lesser-known detail from this period lies in how local elites adapt. In earlier centuries, wealthy provincial aristocrats often invested heavily in public buildings, games, and civic generosity because imperial order made local prestige worthwhile. During the 3rd century, some communities began directing more resources towards survival, private estates, and local defence. Urban civic culture does not disappear, but confidence in the long-term stability of the imperial system weakens. People start thinking regionally and defensively. Religious life changes too. Traditional Roman cults continue, but the atmosphere of crisis encourages new spiritual searching. Mystery religions spread. Christianity grows steadily despite periodic persecution. Christians establish networks of charity, mutual aid, and community support that can appear especially meaningful during epidemic and social instability. The empire still regards Christianity with suspicion at intervals because Christians refuse participation in certain state cult practices tied to imperial unity. Yet persecution never fully suppresses the movement. In fact, martyr stories often strengthen Christian identity. Climate may also play a role in the empire's strain, though the evidence is complex. Tree rings, ice cores, sediment studies, and other environmental data suggest that parts of the Roman world experienced changing climate conditions during late antiquity. Some regions face drought pressures, agricultural patterns shift. The relationship between climate and political crisis remains debated because human societies respond in varied ways to environmental stress. No single explanation fully accounts for Rome's troubles, but climate fluctuations likely intensified existing vulnerabilities in certain areas. The Roman military itself changes under pressure. Frontier armies become more mobile in some regions. Cavalry grows in importance. Recruitment patterns shift. Non-Roman soldiers serve in larger numbers. Fortifications expand. The image of the disciplined early imperial legionary slowly evolves into something more flexible, but also more regionally fragmented. The army remains formidable, but maintaining it consumes increasing amounts of imperial resources, and still, the empire survives. This is perhaps the most remarkable fact of the 3rd century. Another state might have shattered completely under such pressure. Rome bends repeatedly without fully breaking. Administrators continue collecting taxes. Roads remain in use. Cities function unevenly but persist. Emperors continue issuing laws. Trade contracts survive. Families marry, worship, inherit property, and bury their dead beneath the shadow of imperial instability. The survival comes partly through sheer institutional depth. Centuries of administration, infrastructure, military organisation, and cultural integration create momentum difficult to destroy quickly. But survival also requires transformation. The old Augustan system, elegant in its balance between monarchy and republican illusion, no longer fits the scale of crisis. A different kind of empire is beginning to emerge. By the late 3rd century, emperors no longer pretend as carefully to be merely first citizens among equals. Military authority becomes more explicit. Court ceremony grows more elaborate and distant. The ruler appears less like a republican magistrate and more like a sacred monarch. Rome itself matters less as an administrative centre, because emperors spend increasing time near frontiers where armies and threats demand attention. The Mediterranean world is still Roman, but it is changing shape. The old confidence of marble forums and senatorial debate is giving way to fortified cities, mobile courts, larger bureaucracies, harsher taxation, and rulers who understand that survival now depends on control more than persuasion. The empire has entered an age where endurance matters more than elegance, and from that harsh transformation will emerge both a renewed Roman world and the beginning of the end for the Western Empire that once believed itself eternal. By the time Diocletian rises to power in 284 CE, Rome has survived so many emergencies that survival itself has become a kind of revolution. The empire still exists, but not in the old way. It has been battered by invasions, rival emperors, plague, inflation, breakaway regimes, and the terrifying realization that the centre can no longer assume control simply because it is the centre. The Augustan mask of restored republican calm has worn thin. Diocletian does not try to polish it back into place. He builds a harder empire. His answer to crisis is division, discipline, and hierarchy. One emperor is no longer enough for a world this large and unstable. Diocletian eventually creates the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4, with 2 senior emperors called Augusti and 2 junior emperors called Caesars. Each governs closer to threatened regions, each backed by military authority, each meant to provide smoother succession and faster response. It is an elegant solution on paper. And for a time it works better than the chaos that came before. The empire becomes more governable because power is no longer waiting in one distant capital for news weeks too late. But the Tetrarchy also reveals something unsettling. Rome is no longer the obvious heart of Roman power. Emperors now rule from places such as Nicomedia, Milan, Trier, and Sirmium, cities closer to armies and frontiers. Rome remains sacred, ancient, symbolic, full of monuments and memory, but memory is not enough to command a crisis. The empire's political centre of gravity begins moving away from the city that gave it a name. Diocletian's reforms reach deeply into administration and society. Provinces are subdivided to prevent governors from becoming too powerful. Bureaucracy expands. Taxation becomes more systematic, more intrusive, and often heavier. The army is reorganised. Court ceremony grows more elaborate, placing the emperor at a greater distance from ordinary subjects and even from traditional elites. The ruler is no longer simply the first citizen. He becomes a figure surrounded by ritual, rank, access, and awe. This may look like vanity, but it is also political technology. After a century in which emperors were made and murdered by soldiers, distance becomes protection. Ceremony makes authority feel sacred rather than negotiable. A man who kneels before the emperor is less likely to imagine him as merely another ambitious general, though history will prove that ceremony alone cannot prevent ambition. Diocletian also attempts economic control, most famously through his edict on maximum prices in 301 CE. The edict tries to fix prices and wages across the empire, threatening severe punishments for violations. It is one of the most remarkable documents of Roman economic anxiety. The surviving fragments list prices for goods and services with astonishing detail, from food and clothing to transport and labour. Scholars still debate how widely or effectively it was enforced, and it likely failed to control inflation in any lasting way, but its ambition reveals a state trying to impose order on forces too complex to command by decree. Religious policy hardens as well. Diocletian launches the last and most severe empire-wide persecution of Christians. Beginning in 303 CE, churches are destroyed, scriptures confiscated, clergy arrested, and sacrifices demanded. The persecution varies by region and ruler, but it marks a final attempt to defend traditional religious unity through coercion. To Diocletian's government, Christianity is not merely a private belief. It is a refusal to participate fully in the sacred order that binds empire, gods, and emperor. Yet the persecution fails. Christianity has already grown too deeply into households, cities, networks of charity, and regional communities. Violence can wound it, but not erase it. Then, in a gesture almost unimaginable for many emperors before him, Diocletian abdicates. He retires to his palace at Split on the Dalmatian coast, where later tradition imagines him tending cabbages, while others struggle for power. The detail may be shaped into moral anecdote, but the larger truth remains strange. A man who remade imperial rule voluntarily steps away. The system he built, however, cannot easily survive the ambitions of those who inherit it. Civil war returns. Out of the struggle emerges Constantine, a ruler as transformative as Augustus and Diocletian, though in a very different way. His rise is military, political, and religious at once. In 312 CE, before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge against Maxentius, later Christian tradition says Constantine receives a heavenly sign promising victory. The exact nature of his belief at that moment remains debated, and the evidence is complicated by later storytelling. What is clear is that Constantine defeats Maxentius, enters Rome, and soon after becomes the most important imperial patron Christianity has ever known. The Edict of Milan in 313 CE, associated with Constantine and Licinius, grants toleration to Christianity and restores confiscated property. Christianity moves from persecuted movement to legally accepted religion. This does not instantly make the empire Christian in every household or province. Traditional cults continue. Pagan aristocrats remain influential. Religious life stays mixed for generations. But the direction of imperial favour changes dramatically. Bishops gain access to power. Churches receive patronage. Christian disputes become matters of imperial concern. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE reveals how deeply the emperor now involves himself in religious unity. The council addresses theological controversy, especially the dispute associated with Arius over the relationship between Christ and God the Father. To modern listeners, such debates may seem abstract, but in the 4th century empire they matter intensely, because religious division threatens social and political cohesion. Constantine does not simply tolerate Christianity. He tries to organise it. The emperor who commands armies now also presides over bishops seeking doctrinal agreement. A lesser-known but important detail is that Constantine continues using imperial imagery that can feel religiously ambiguous. Coins, monuments, and public language do not change overnight from traditional Roman symbolism to fully Christian presentation. The transition is gradual, layered, and politically careful. Constantine's world is not a clean before and after. It is a blend of old imperial habits and new sacred loyalties. His most visible transformation is geographical. Constantine founds a new imperial capital at Byzantium, renamed Constantinople, dedicated in 330 CE. Its location is extraordinary on the Bosporus, commanding routes between Europe and Asia, the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. It is closer to the Danube and eastern frontiers, defensible, wealthy, and strategically brilliant. Rome remains Rome, but Constantinople becomes a new Rome. a Christian imperial city built for the empire's changing realities. The founding of Constantinople does not cause the fall of the Western Empire by itself, despite popular simplifications, but it marks a profound shift. The empire's future increasingly lies in the east, where richer provinces, stronger urban networks, and strategic geography help imperial rule endure. The west remains important, but less economically resilient and more vulnerable to frontier pressures. What survives in the record suggests not abandonment, but gradual imbalance. The 4th century empire is therefore not simply declining. In many ways, it is reorganizing successfully. Bureaucracy becomes more sophisticated, the army remains powerful, cities continue functioning, though unevenly. Christianity provides new networks of identity and authority. Law develops further. Imperial ceremony gives the state a majestic, almost cosmic language of power. The old Roman world has not vanished. It has changed clothes, changed capitals, changed gods, and changed its understanding of authority. Yet transformation creates new tensions. Tax demands weigh heavily on rural populations. Some professions become hereditary to stabilise essential services. Curiales, local city council elites responsible for tax collection and civic obligations, often find their status burdensome rather than purely honourable. Wealthy landowners grow more powerful in the countryside, and poorer people may seek protection under great estates. The empire's attempt to secure stability can reduce mobility and increase dependence. Religious conflict also intensifies. Christians argue with Christians, imperial favour shifts under different rulers, pagan traditions do not disappear quietly, temples remain active in some places while churches rise in others. The empire is not moving from darkness into unity, as later triumphal stories sometimes imply. It is entering a new age of belief, dispute, law, and identity. Sacred truth becomes inseparable from imperial politics. After Constantine, the empire continues to divide authority between rulers, relatives, and regions. The sons of Constantine fight among themselves. Julian briefly attempts to revive traditional religious practices and reduce Christian dominance, earning the later title the apostate from Christian writers. His reign reminds us that the 4th century's religious future was not always obvious to those living through it. The evidence remains incomplete when it comes to the beliefs of ordinary people, who may blend old and new practices quietly for generations. By the time Theodosius I rules in the late 4th century, Christianity favoured by imperial authority becomes increasingly dominant, and traditional public cults face stronger legal restrictions. Theodosius is also the last emperor to rule over both eastern and western halves of the empire together. After his death in 395 CE, the division between east and west becomes more permanent in practice, even though people continue to imagine one Roman Empire in theory. This is the world that would have astonished the Old Republic. Emperors rule from distant courts, bishops advise rulers, Constantinople gleams beside the Bosporus. The army includes large numbers of men from beyond old Roman frontiers. Taxes bind peasants to state needs. Law speaks in the voice of Christian monarchy. Rome itself remains revered, but no longer governs the world as it once did. And yet a Roman from Augustus's age might still recognise the deeper habits roads, ranks, commands, courts, tax lists, military camps, ceremonies of power, the insistence that order must be made visible. Rome survives by becoming something else. The mystery is that transformation can look like strength and weakness at the same time. The empire adapts because it must, but every adaptation admits that the older system could no longer bear the weight. By the end of the 4th century, the Roman world is more fortified, more Christian, more bureaucratic, more divided, and more dependent on regional power than ever before. It is still magnificent. It is still dangerous. It is still Roman. But in the West, the ground beneath it is beginning to loosen. The Western Empire does not fall like a tower struck once at the base. It loosens, province by province, army by army, tax district by tax district, until the old structure still appears on maps but no longer commands the weight it claims. Imperial laws continue to be issued. Emperors still wear the purple. Officials still write in the language of a Roman authority. Coins still carry images of victory and eternity. Yet beyond the ceremonial surface, local realities are changing faster than imperial language can admit. The frontier along the Danube becomes one of the great pressure points. In the late 4th century, Gothic groups seek entry into Roman territory, driven in part by fear of the Huns, whose arrival from the steppe unsettles peoples far beyond Rome's borders. The Huns are not the only cause of migration, and scholars still debate the full chain of pressures behind these movements, but their appearance intensifies an already unstable frontier world. In 376 CE, Goths are allowed to cross into the empire as refugees and potential military settlers. What follows is a disaster of mismanagement. Roman officials exploit them, supplies fail, resentment grows, and rebellion erupts. The catastrophe comes at Adrianople in 378 CE. The Eastern Emperor Valens marches against Gothic forces and is killed in a crushing Roman defeat. The battle shocks the empire because it reveals that groups once treated as manageable outsiders can destroy an imperial army and kill an emperor in open battle. Adrianople is not the end of Rome, but it is a warning written in blood. The empire increasingly needs barbarian soldiers, barbarian commanders, and negotiated settlements with groups it cannot simply annihilate. The word barbarian itself must be handled carefully. Roman writers use it as a cultural and political label. often flattening complex peoples into stereotypes of savagery. The Goths, Vandals, Franks, Burgundians, Huns, and others are not faceless destroyers. They have leaders, laws, families, ambitions, loyalties, and histories of contact with Rome. Many serve in Roman armies. Some speak Latin or Greek. Some are Christian, often Arian Christians rather than Nicene Christians, which adds another layer of tension. They are both outsiders and insiders, enemies and employees, threats and partners. The late Roman world is not a clean border between civilization and chaos. It is a zone of entanglement. In the West, that entanglement becomes harder to manage because the state's resources shrink. Britain becomes increasingly difficult to defend and eventually slips from effective imperial control. Gaul faces repeated incursions and internal struggles, and Spain becomes contested. North Africa, crucial for grain and tax revenue, grows vulnerable. Italy itself, once protected by distance and prestige, begins to feel danger directly. The Western government relies heavily on powerful generals, many of them of barbarian origin or commanding mixed forces, because emperors are often young, weak, or politically constrained. Stilicho, a general of Vandal descent serving the Western court, becomes one of the last great defenders of the Western Empire. His career shows the paradox of the age. Rome depends on men whose identities complicate old Roman categories. Stilicho is loyal to the imperial system, yet suspicion surrounds him because of origin, ambition, and court politics. He fights Gothic forces under Alaric and tries to hold the Western structure together, but palace intrigue destroys him. In 408 CE, Stilicho is executed. The purge that follows weakens the West at precisely the wrong moment. Alaric and the Goths move toward Rome. In 410 CE, the city is sacked. The sack of Rome is less destructive materially than later imagination sometimes suggests, and Alaric's forces do not erase the city, but symbolically, it is immense. For the first time in nearly 8 centuries, a foreign army enters and plunders Rome. The city that once destroyed Carthage, humbled Greece, and ruled the Mediterranean is now vulnerable inside its own walls. The shock echoes across the empire. Christian and pagan writers interpret the event differently. Some blame abandonment of the old gods. Others, like Augustine, argue that earthly cities are always fragile and that no empire can offer final security. The evidence remains incomplete for many details of the sack, but its psychological force is beyond doubt. Yet even after 410 the Western Empire continues. This is essential. Rome's fall is not a single dramatic ending. Emperors still reign in the West. Armies still fight. Laws still circulate. The imperial court, often based at Ravenna, remains surrounded by marshes and defences. Ravenna is safer than Rome, closer to northern military routes, and more practical for a government under pressure. But the shift is revealing. The old capital has become too symbolic and too exposed, while the real machinery of survival hides in a watery refuge. Meanwhile, the Vandals cross into North Africa and seize Carthage in 439 CE. This is one of the most devastating blows to the Western Empire. North Africa is not a distant ornamental possession. It is economically vital, a source of grain, oil, and tax revenue. Losing it cripples Western finances and naval strength. Without African revenues, paying armies becomes harder. Without armies, holding provinces becomes harder. Without provinces, revenues shrink further. The Western Empire enters a vicious circle. A lesser known but important detail is how much late Roman authority depends on tax systems rather than sheer territorial pride. Maps can make empire look like coloured land, but governments survive through revenue, soldiers need pay, fortifications need maintenance, officials need support, grain needs transport. Once the tax base fragments, imperial claims become increasingly ceremonial. A ruler may still call himself emperor, but if he cannot reliably collect taxes or command armies, his title becomes a memory of power rather than power itself. In 455 CE, Rome is sacked again, this time by the Vandals. The event gives later languages the word vandalism, though the historical Vandals were more complex than the word suggests. Their kingdom in North Africa is organised, maritime, and politically significant. They do not exist merely to destroy. Still, the second sack deepens the sense that the old world is inverted. Rome is no longer the predator at the centre of the Mediterranean. It is a prize others can reach. The Hunnic Empire under Attila adds another layer of fear. Attila's campaigns threaten both eastern and western territories. He invades Gaul and later Italy, extracting tribute and spreading panic. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451 CE, involving Romans, Visigoths, and others against the Huns, is often presented as a decisive clash between civilization and barbarism, but the reality is messier. It is a coalition war in a fragmented Roman world where former enemies fight beside Rome against a greater threat. Attila dies in 453 in Hunnic power fragments, but the damage to the political landscape remains. By the mid-5th century, Western emperors become increasingly dependent on military strongmen. Men such as Ricimer wield real power behind the throne, making and unmaking emperors. The imperial title continues, but its substance thins. Provinces operate under local rulers, barbarian kings, or semi-independent Roman elites, in Gaul, Hispania, and elsewhere. People adapt to new authorities while preserving Roman law, language, administration, and Christianity in altered forms. The end of imperial control does not mean the instant end of Roman life. This is one of the most important truths about the Western collapse. Ordinary people do not wake one morning in a new age called the Middle Ages. A landowner may still manage estates. A bishop may still settle disputes. A farmer still worries about weather, taxes, rent, and soldiers. A craftsman still sells goods in a town whose walls were built under Roman rule. Coins may become scarcer, long-distance trade may weaken, public building may decline, but continuity and rupture coexist. The empire fades unevenly. In 476 CE, the commander Odoacer deposes the young Western Emperor Romulus Augustulus. The symbolism is almost too perfect. The last Western emperor bears the name of Rome's legendary founder and its first emperor, yet he is a minor figure removed with little drama. Odoacer sends imperial insignia to the Eastern emperor and rules Italy as king, nominally acknowledging Eastern authority. Later historians choose 476 as the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and the date is useful. The people living through it may not have experienced it as a clean ending. The Eastern emperor remains. Roman institutions continue in altered form. The Senate in Rome still exists for a time. The idea of empire does not die. No single explanation fully accounts for the Western collapse. Invasions matter, but they do not explain everything. Internal political instability matters, but Rome had survived that before. Economic weakness, tax failure, military dependence on federate groups, elite self-protection, disease, climate pressures, succession problems, and administrative division all play roles. The West falls because pressures interlock. Each crisis makes the next harder to solve. The Eastern Empire survives because it has stronger revenues, richer cities, better strategic positioning, and more resilient administrative structures. This contrast matters. Rome does not fall everywhere. The Roman state continues in the East for nearly 1,000 years, though modern historians often call it Byzantine. The survival of Constantinople proves that the story is not simply moral decay or inevitable decline. Circumstances differ, structures differ, geography matters. But in the West, the imperial system built from the Tiber outward finally loses coherence. The roads remain, the aqueducts stand in places, though maintenance falters. Latin continues evolving into new languages. Roman law survives in memory, practice, and later codification. Bishops inherit civic roles once held by imperial officials. Barbarian kings present themselves not as enemies of Rome alone, but as heirs to Roman legitimacy. The empire unravels, but Roman forms are too deeply woven into the world to disappear. The fall is therefore both real and strangely incomplete. What ends is the Western imperial government. What remains is almost everything transformed cities, churches, laws, titles, languages, ruins, roads, habits of rule, and the dream that Rome had once made order visible across the earth. The last emperor in the West vanishes into obscurity, but Rome itself is not finished speaking. After Rome falls in the West, Rome continues. That is the strange afterlife of the empire. The political structure that once ruled from Britain to Syria fractures, but the idea of Rome proves far harder to kill than any emperor. It survives in courts, churches, military titles, tax habits, city plans, legal language, and the ambitions of rulers who never saw the old empire whole. The Western imperial throne is gone, yet the world it shaped does not simply return to what existed before. There is no clean restoration of pre-Roman Europe. The empire has entered the soil. In Constantinople, the Roman Empire remains very much alive. Its people do not call themselves Byzantines. That label comes later. They understand themselves as Romans, heirs of Constantine, Augustus, and a state that has changed language, religion, and geography without abandoning its claim to continuity. Greek becomes dominant where Latin once held imperial prestige. Christianity saturates public identity, and the Eastern court develops ceremonies of extraordinary splendour, yet in law. Diplomacy, military ideology, and imperial self-understanding. This is still Rome. The empire has moved eastward and transformed, but it has not ended. The Emperor Justinian, ruling in the 6th century, makes that continuity visible with breathtaking ambition. He orders the codification of Roman law, creating a legal inheritance that later centuries will study, revive, and reshape across Europe. His armies reconquer North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain, briefly restoring imperial authority over territories once lost in the West. In Constantinople, Hagia Sophia rises beneath a vast dome that seems almost to float above light. It is not a pagan temple, not an old Republican forum, not an Augustan monument, but it is Roman ambition in another form architecture used to announce that heaven, law, and empire still meet under imperial command. And yet Justinian's restoration also reveals the limits of memory. The reconquest of Italy devastates much of the peninsula. Rome changes hands repeatedly. Aqueducts are damaged, populations shrink. War, plague, and economic strain leave the old imperial heartland exhausted. The Western Empire can be partially reclaimed, but the old Roman world cannot simply be rebuilt by decree. Time has moved through it. The landscape itself has changed. The city of Rome becomes something quieter and stranger. It is no longer the capital of an empire, but it remains a place of immense symbolic force. Its population declines from the crowded millions or near-million scale of imperial memory to a much smaller urban community living among gigantic ruins. Temples become churches. Marble is reused in new buildings. Ancient columns are carried into basilicas. Statues disappear, are buried, broken, burned for lime, or preserved by accident. The Forum becomes partly a field where animals graze. The Colosseum, once an arena of imperial spectacle, becomes fortress, quarry, shrine, and ruin, Rome survives by repurposing itself. There is something almost dreamlike about this medieval city living inside the skeleton of the ancient one. People build houses against theatre walls, churches occupy imperial halls, markets gather near arches whose original dedications are half forgotten. The past is not hidden, but its meaning changes. A triumphal arch no longer celebrates exactly the victory it once proclaimed. It becomes part of a Christian city, then part of a pilgrimage route, then part of antiquarian wonder, then part of modern heritage. Rome's stones keep outliving their explanations. Roman law becomes one of the empire's most powerful ghosts. In the early Middle Ages, different post-Roman kingdoms preserve and adapt to Roman legal traditions, especially for Roman populations living under new rulers. Later, in medieval universities, the study of Justinian's legal code helps shape European legal thought. Concepts of property, contracts, citizenship, authority, procedure, and sovereignty carry Roman traces forward, though always altered by new societies. Law proves more durable than legions. Language carries another inheritance. Spoken Latin evolves differently across regions, becoming the Romance languages Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, and others. These are not museum relics. They are living descendants, proof that imperial power can vanish while everyday speech continues changing in the mouths of farmers, traders, priests, soldiers, mothers, and children. Classical Latin remains a language of church, scholarship, law, and prestige for centuries. In this way, Rome continues both in ordinary sound and formal authority. Christianity also transforms the Roman legacy. The empire that once persecuted Christians becomes the framework through which Christianity spreads across Europe and beyond. Bishops inherit civic responsibilities. The Bishop of Rome, later the Pope, gains increasing spiritual and political significance, partly because Rome's old authority still clings to the city. The Church preserves texts, administers communities, negotiates with kings, and adopts aspects of Roman organization. The empire falls in the West, but an institution shaped within it becomes one of the defining powers of the post-Roman world. Rulers repeatedly try to claim Rome. Charlemagne is crowned emperor in 800 CE, creating a Western imperial revival that presents itself as restoration, even though it is a new Frankish and Christian order. Later, the Holy Roman Empire carries the name forward for centuries, sometimes more as aspiration than reality. In Moscow, rulers imagine their city as a third Rome after Constantinople falls to the Ottomans in 1453. Each claim is different, each is selective, but all reveal the same gravitational pull. Rome becomes not just a past empire, but a language of legitimacy. To rule greatly is to stand somewhere in Rome's shadow. The physical traces remain equally powerful. Roman roads influence later routes, bridges are repaired and reused, aqueduct lines guide urban water systems or stand as monuments to lost engineering. Amphitheatres become neighbourhoods, fortresses, or sources of building material. In North Africa, the Middle East, Spain, France, Britain, and the Balkans, ruins sit under sun, rain, sand, vineyards, cities, and fields. Some are famous, others are half buried, known mostly to local memory. Each one is a fragment of an empire that once made distance feel governable. Modern archaeology adds new layers to the afterlife. Excavations reveal shop counters in Pompeii, letters from frontier forts, shipwrecked cargoes, sewer remains, children's toys, medical tools, graffiti, curse tablets, military diplomas, and household shrines. These discoveries soften the marble image of Rome by restoring human scale. The empire becomes not only emperors and battles, but people making meals, writing complaints, fearing illness, honouring gods, loving families, cheating customers, filing lawsuits, and hoping to be remembered. What survives in the record suggests a civilization both grand and ordinary, both alien and familiar. Still, the mystery of Rome's decline remains unresolved because Rome was never one simple thing. It was a city, a republic, an empire, a military system, a legal tradition, a slave society, a road network, a tax machine, a religious landscape, a cultural identity, and eventually a memory claimed by others. Asking why Rome fell depends partly on which Rome is meant. The Western imperial government fell in the 5th century. The Eastern Roman Empire endured until the 15th. Roman law survived far beyond both. Latin became new languages. Roman Christianity became medieval Christendom. Roman ruins became warnings, quarries, inspirations, and tourist destinations. Rome falls, survives, transforms, and returns as an idea. No single explanation fully accounts for this afterlife. Power usually disappears more completely than Rome did. Many empires leave monuments, but Rome leaves systems of thought. Many conquerors build roads, but Rome's roads become symbols. Many states write laws, but Rome's legal memory reshapes later civilizations. Many capitals decline, but Rome's ruins become a mirror in which later ages examine their own fear of collapse. That may be why the city still feels inhabited by more than its living population. To walk through Rome is to move through overlapping worlds. Republican temples stand near imperial forums. Christian basilicas rise over pagan spaces. Medieval towers lean above ancient foundations. Renaissance palaces reuse columns older than the languages spoken around them. Modern traffic circles monuments built for emperors whose bodies vanished long ago. The city does not preserve time neatly. It lets centuries crowd together until the past feels unfinished. And perhaps that is the final lesson of ancient Rome. Civilizations rarely vanish in the way stories prefer. They leave debris, habits, words, laws, roads, wounds, and dreams. They survive in fragments, sometimes glorious, sometimes troubling, often misunderstood. Rome's greatness cannot be separated from its violence, and its collapse cannot erase its achievements. It is both warning and inheritance. The empire that began beside a muddy river crossing becomes a world. The world becomes a memory. The memory becomes a foundation under later history, visible whenever a courthouse uses columns, whenever a legal phrase echoes Latin, whenever a road follows an ancient line, whenever a city wonders whether its own power is as permanent as it looks. Rome after Rome is not an ending. It is the long echo of a civilization that lost its empire but kept shaping the imagination of those who came after. The ruins grow quieter as the story loosens its hold. The marble cools, the roads darken, the arches stand against the evening sky with the patience of things that have survived being misunderstood. Rome is no longer a marching army, no longer a crowded forum, no longer an emperor's command crossing mountains and seas. It is stone, memory, language, and shadow. It is the shape of a road beneath a modern street, the curve of an old wall inside a later house, the faint Latin root inside an ordinary word spoken without ceremony. Civilizations do not know how they will be remembered. The people who lived inside ancient Rome did not imagine themselves as symbols. They worried about rent, weather, marriage, inheritance, illness, food, status, work, and the uncertain favour of power. They walked past monuments as part of daily life. They heard wheels on stone, water in fountains, vendors calling in the morning, soldiers moving through gates, and temple rituals fading into the noise of the city. What feels ancient now was once immediate. What feels inevitable now was once fragile. Rome's long history leaves no simple comfort. Strength does not guarantee permanence. Wealth does not prevent fear. Law does not erase violence. Roads can connect an empire, but they can also carry armies, disease, and news of disaster. Yet Rome also shows that collapse is rarely pure disappearance. Something remains. A wall, a phrase, a habit of government, a book copied by careful hands, a church built inside an old hall, a farmer's field above a buried villa, a child's writing tablet preserved by mud at the edge of the world. The empire faded unevenly, but time kept working through it. Grass entered the forum, rain washed over broken inscriptions. Shepherds passed through spaces where senators once argued. New languages rose from old speech. New kingdoms borrowed old titles. The city that had claimed eternity became a place where eternity looked less like triumph and more like endurance. And so the story ends not with a final trumpet, not with one last emperor, not even with a gate closing in the dark. It ends with the image of Rome at dusk, layered and quiet, its stones holding warmth from the day. The river still moves past the hills, the ruins still gather shadows, and beneath the silence the old world remains, not alive as it was, not gone as it might have been, but resting somewhere between memory and earth.